Chapter 11. First Year. Birthdays, books, and the Beatles. Fortunately, Madame Pomfrey was able to undo the hex with a few flicks of her wand. Still, she lectured all of them on the misuse of dangerous magic. "As if we all wanted to look like Bigfoot," James complained as they left the hospital wing, skin still tinging from the hair growth. "It had to be Severus. He coated the sweets in one of his potions. I know it," Sirius seethed. "Yeah, we all know it, mate," James replied. "Don't worry, we'll get him back." "I'm so sorry," Peter wailed for about the 100th time. "I really thought they were from my mum." "It's fine, Peter," James patted his shoulder. "Just wish you'd given them to us first thing on a Monday. Then we could have at least bunked off Transfiguration." "I demand retribution," Sirius shouted, raising his wand dramatically. Remus laughed. James did too. "And you shall have it," he replied, pushing his glasses back up on his nose. "Patience is a virtue, Black. Vengeance like this takes time. Don't suppose you've got another brilliant idea, have you, Remus?" "Sorry." Remus shook his head. His heart was still pounding from the terror of it. If he'd seen Snape at that moment, he would have throttled him, never mind pranking him. "I'll help you, James," Peter piped up. "I'll do everything. I won't be scared this time. They were just turning the corner which led to Gryffindor Tower when somebody behind them called out, "Sirius!" All four boys turned. Sirius made a small shocked noise. It was Bellatrix Black. "What do you want?" he asked, looking down and scuffing his shoes on the flagstone floor. It was the most unserious posture imaginable, Remus thought. He also noticed that James stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with his friend. "Come here and address me properly," the seventh-year witch snapped in response. Sirius didn't move. Bellatrix withdrew her wand. Remus was shocked, and for the first time since he'd been at Hogwarts, he felt frightened. "Come here," she said in a low voice, "or I'll make you. And it won't be a childish little hair-growth charm, I promise." Sirius walked forward, shaking his head at James, who tried to follow. They all watched the cousins speaking in quiet voices at the end of the hallway for long, uncomfortable minutes. Sirius barely looked up from the ground the whole time. Finally, she patted him on the head, then turned on her heel and left. They all exhaled, relieved. Sirius walked back to them shakily. In silence, they all entered the portrait hole and sat down at their usual sofa. "All right, Sirius?" James asked first. "Yeah," he nodded, looking paler than usual. She wanted to invite me for tea on my birthday. I think my mum must have made her, probably held a family conference, trying to bring me back into the fold." "Just because you're in a different house?" "And the company I'm keeping," he smirked at them all. "So when's your birthday?" 2 weeks, the 3rd. I've got to go to this tea, though. Bella's not joking about knowing some really vile curses." "We'll do something afterwards, then. Something good, yeah?" Remus and Peter nodded enthusiastically, but in the back of Remus's mind, he remembered that the 3rd was the night of the full moon. Sirius turned 12, and Remus wasn't there to celebrate it, though he didn't think anyone minded. James was Sirius's best friend after all, and Peter still liked to think that James belonged to him a little bit too, so Remus would have been the odd one out, even if he hadn't been locked away in a shack trying to rip himself apart. Madame Pomfrey tried him with a sleeping draught this time before the moon rose, but apparently it had no effect. What was worse, he managed to give himself his biggest scar yet, right across his back. Pomfrey made him stay in the hospital wing all day afterward, which was actually fortuitous. It meant he could just tell his friends he'd taken suddenly ill. They were still a bit confused as to why he hadn't told them anything about feeling sick beforehand, but went along with it. They probably thought he was fairly odd, and by now accepted almost anything he told them. He wouldn't have enjoyed the birthday. James talked to Madame Hooch and arranged a lunchtime flying lesson for the 3 of them. After dinner, before Sirius had to go and change for tea with his cousins, James and Peter had led the Gryffindor table in a round of happy birthday, followed by "For he's a jolly good fellow." According to the students Remus heard from afterwards, they had sung "And so say all of us" over and over, getting louder and louder until Professor McGonagall had to threaten them with detention if they didn't stop. As November marched on, the days grew shorter and the castle darker. They spent less of their time outside and more of it huddled by the fire in the common room, playing card games and plotting revenge against Snape. The first term was drawing to a close, and the teachers seemed to be piling on more homework than ever. Whenever Sirius and Remus were away from Peter and James, usually when the other two were in the library, Sirius was reading to him. They finished A History of Magic in just under 2 weeks, and then alternated between A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration and Magical Drafts and Potions for the rest of term. When the Marauders worked on their homework as a group, he even took to reading aloud as if to himself, claiming it helped him think. This was very much to James's annoyance, who preferred silence. Though they couldn't possibly cover the entire syllabus in such a short time, to everyone's amazement, including his own, Remus's marks were improving at an astonishing rate. Sirius had apparently had the right idea. Remus's ability to recall and retain information was remarkable, and he found himself raising his hand in lessons for the first time in his life. Sirius's marks, on the other hand, began to fall. He spent so much time trying to secretly assist Remus that he apparently no longer did any of the extra reading he prided himself in all year. As it was, his own homework became average, passable, and fell behind James's for the first time. James was oblivious, of course, and merely assumed that he was actually improving. "But you spend so much time in the library," Remus whispered to him once after Sirius received an acceptable mark on his charms essay. "I thought you were studying." Remus himself had still not worked up the courage to visit the library. The thought of all those books horrified him. "I am studying," Sirius replied cheerily. "Just not this stuff." He folded the essay away. "I'm looking up cognitive interpretation spells. So you can read by yourself. It's really tricky. OWL level, actually, but I think I've almost got it. Don't worry, Lupin, it's not as if I'm failing. This is much more interesting anyway." Remus felt horribly guilty, of course, as well as mildly ashamed that Sirius was devoting so much time to helping him. He honestly couldn't remember a time in his life that anyone had tried so hard on his behalf. It made him wish he could do something, anything in return. But other than having a difficult family, Sirius Black seemed to want for nothing at all. In fact, there was one thing Remus could give Sirius which even James could not, but it hardly felt worth mentioning. Something Sirius called Muggle Insight. It began when Remus finally plucked up the courage to ask about Sirius's record collection. Sirius was only too happy to share. Other than his racing broom, which was still at home, his albums were his dearest possessions. Remus could easily see why. He had Introducing the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, and Help, as well as Abbey Road, Beggar's Banquet, and Sticky Fingers. "Mick Jagger has to be the coolest Muggle I've ever seen," Sirius gushed. 2 Led Zeppelin albums. Remus hadn't listened to them before, but the older boys at St. Edmunds were all obsessed, and a Simon and Garfunkel LP hidden at the back. Wizards, it turned out, did not generally think much of Muggle music. All of Sirius's records had been gifted to him by his cousin Andromeda, who was apparently the first black sheep of the Black family, having left school a few years beforehand and married a Muggle. "I hardly ever see her," Sirius explained. "Not since the wedding, but she posts these to me every now and then. She sends them the Muggle way, so Mum doesn't find out. She doesn't understand how the post office works." So although he had an impressive collection by any 11-year-old standards, Sirius' musical passions existed almost entirely in a vacuum. He wasn't aware of any other Beatles songs other than the ones he already had, pressed into vinyl. He'd never listened to the radio or watched Top the Pops or opened a copy of NME before. As such, he found Remus endlessly fascinating on the subject of music and Muggle culture. "You've actually seen them, though?" he said, awed. "Seen them performing?" "Not in real life or anything," Remus replied uncomfortably. "No, I know. On the telephone." Sirius nodded sagely. Remus stifled laughter. "On the television," he corrected. "It's more like those moving paintings you lot have, only black and white, and only the Beatles. The Stones came on once and Matron made us turn it off because of their hair." "What about their hair?" "Too long," Remus shrugged. "She said they looked dirty." "My hair's much longer," Sirius said, frowning. "Yeah, it is, but Muggle boys don't have long hair. Not normally." "Don't tell him that, he'll shave his head," Peter teased. He threw a gobstone across the board on the floor. They'd been playing a lazy game off and on for the past few days, trying to teach Remus the rules. It rolled onto one of Sirius's stones and knocked it out of the ring, immediately squirting out a disgusting-smelling liquid, which Sirius barely dodged in time. Peter grinned. "Ha! Take that, muggle lover!" Sirius swore loudly and left to change his clothes. Chapter 12. First Year. Christmas, 1971. Lupin! Perhaps you can tell me. What are the transfigurative properties of Lapis Philosophorum? McGonagall called out toward the end of their lesson one day. She gave him a very pointed look. The last time she'd asked him a question in front of the class, he'd shrugged and looked away. Remus racked his brain. Well, I think that's the one that turns stuff into gold, if you use it right, and Cleopatra the alchemist used it to turn lead into silver, I think. Correct! McGonagall sounded as if she was trying to mask her surprise. 5 points to Gryffindor, and another 5 for making the connection to Cleopatra the alchemist. She's not mentioned in Transfiguration for Beginners. Did you read that in your history text? Remus nodded, aware that everyone was looking at him. Well, excellent. Some of my third-year students are incapable of cross-referencing their studies like that. I'm pleased to see you're taking such an interest. She addressed the class. And we'll begin discussing alchemy after Christmas, which reminds me, with the holidays approaching, I'd like to ask any students planning to remain at Hogwarts over break to let me know by the end of next week. Thank you. You're dismissed. The class stood up to leave. A few people patted Remus on the back as they passed. Mr. Lupin, if you have a moment, McGonagall said, just as he was passing her desk. His stomach dropped. He'd gone 2 weeks without a detention from her. He should have known something was coming. He stood still, shoving his hands deep in his pockets and staring at his feet as the rest of the class filtered out. Finally, the classroom empty, she walked over and shut the door, right in James's face, and turned back into the room. Well done today, Remus, McGonagall said kindly. You've been doing really well lately. He looked up at her, startled. She laughed. Don't look surprised. I'm very impressed. Professor Slughorn and Professor Flitwick have said the same. I wanted a quick word with you about Christmas. I've spoken with Mrs. Orwell. Who? The lady who runs St. Edmund's. Oh, right, matron. Quite. As you know, the full moon will occur twice in December, the 2nd, that was next week, and the 31st, New Year's Eve. Mrs. Orwell seems to be of the opinion that you'd be better off remaining at Hogwarts over Christmas for this season. I hope you aren't too disappointed. Remus shrugged. I'm not fussed either way. Professor McGonagall nodded, very seriously. I shall add your name to the list then. I'll see you next week, Remus. James invited Sirius and Remus to visit him over the break, knowing that neither of them were facing a particularly merry Christmas otherwise. Remus was forced to decline, even if he hadn't been incredibly shy about visiting James's home and meeting his parents. He was still legally in the care of St. Edmund's local authority and needed written permission from Matron to leave Hogwarts. Sirius, who would have loved the opportunity to spend 2 weeks mucking about with James, racing their brooms and eating chocolate, also had to refuse. His family had made it quite clear they did not approve of him visiting the Potter family under any circumstances. Bellatrix, that bitch! She's been feeding my parents information, he explained darkly. Apparently I've disgraced them enough already. If I go to yours, then it'll only get worse. I'm sorry, mate. Remus went to the edge of the grounds with the marauders, all to wave them off on the last day of term. We'll send you owls, James promised. See if you can come up with our next plan of attack on Snape. Remus grinned and promised he would try. He hoped that the letters James sent would not be too long. He was the only Gryffindor first year staying behind for the break, and trudged a lonely path back up to the castle. The next day he enjoyed lying in, something they were never allowed to do at St. Edmund's. He slept until 10 o'clock when Frank Longbottom poked his head round the door. Come on, Lupin, you'll miss breakfast at this rate. Remus liked Frank. He had a broad, friendly face and an easy-going manner. He seemed altogether solid and dependable, like an elder brother. He understood that Remus was used to being an outsider and tried to include him whenever possible without pushing too hard. After breakfast, Frank disappeared to the owlery and Remus sat glumly in the common room, feeling the next 2 weeks stretched before him, empty and lonely. He considered a walk round the grounds, but it had started to rain heavily. He played a few of Sirius's records and flipped through a stack of magazines some fourth years had left behind, just looking at the pictures. They were mostly of pretty, glamorous witches and handsome wizards. He supposed it was a fashion mag. The next few days passed in much the same way. Frank would get him up in the morning, he'd eat all his meals with the remaining Gryffindors in the hall, but otherwise he was left to his own devices. He was so bored at one point that he even thought about doing some of the homework he'd been set. He'd been trying to improve his handwriting, but it was almost impossible with the ridiculous feather quills they were provided. No one would answer him properly when he asked why they couldn't just use bureaus. Even pencil might have been better. He actually did try to read for a while, but after attempting a paragraph from his herbology text, he gave up in frustration. He copied out a few of the diagrams instead. Remus didn't mind drawing. He liked the freedom of it. Every day he walked round the castle for a few hours with his map. The other boys had long since discarded theirs, having learnt all the classroom locations after the first week or so. But Remus hung on to his, still bothered by its incompleteness. He'd begun marking it up himself, adding points of interest, hiding places, and the secret passageway he'd found. The rest of the time he spent avoiding the teachers who were concerned about his being alone. He wasn't the only student left in the school, but most of the others were 6th and 7th years, who generally stayed in the library, revising hard for exams or working on their coursework. Slughorn was holding special extra potions classes in the dungeons, but Remus hadn't been invited and probably wouldn't have gone anyway. He practiced a few spells and entertained himself for a good few hours trying to see how many objects in their dorm room he could levitate at once. He made a game of it, throwing various objects, books, gobstones, decks of cards, up in the air, and trying to stop them before they hit the ground. He had to stop that eventually when Frank knocked on the door and told him irritably to keep the noise down. Saturday, 24th of December, 1971. On Christmas Eve, Remus was woken earlier than usual. It was still quite dark. Heavy rain pelted the thick glass window panes, the sound of it loud enough to echo through the empty room. But that wasn't what had disturbed him. The door was creaking open, and someone stepped inside. Sitting up and peering through the gloom, Remus expected to see Longbottom telling him to get up for breakfast. But it wasn't Frank. It was a very soggy and dishevelled-looking boy, with long hair and a haughty face. "Sirius!" Remus leapt out of bed, overjoyed to see his friend. Sirius pushed his wet hair out of his eyes. He'd clearly been out in the rain. He pulled off his heavy travelling cloak, plopping it in a pile on the floor. "All right, Lupin," he grinned. "Freezing, isn't it?" He pointed his wand at the fireplace. "Incendio!" "What are you doing here?" "Had enough," he said simply, pulling off his boots, which were caked in mud. "Got into an argument with Dad, then the whole family got into it. All the usual stuff. Called me a blood traitor, shame of the family, etc., etc." He flopped down on his bed. "So I left." "Wow." Remus rubbed his eyes, awestruck. "How did you get here?" "Flu powder," Sirius shrugged. "To the pub in the village, then just walked up." "Wow," Remus repeated. "I'm starving. They sent me to bed last night without dinner. Come on, get dressed, breakfast." McGonagall was not as pleased to see Sirius as Remus was. The two boys attempted to take their seats at the table as if nothing was out of the ordinary, but she appeared at their side almost immediately. "Mr. Black," she said, a note of warning in her voice, which Remus recognized from his detentions. "What is the meaning of this?" "I missed you too, Professor," he grinned up at her. The corner of the old witch's mouth twitched, but she kept her composure. "You were seen walking onto the grounds from Hogsmeade at 6 o'clock this morning. Do you care to explain yourself further?" Sirius shook his head. "Not really, Professor. That's pretty much all there is to it." McGonagall sighed, shaking her head lightly. She had the same look of pity she usually reserved for Remus. "Very well, Mr. Black. I shall have to contact your parents, of course, so that they know where you are." "No need," Sirius replied, nodding at the flock of owls which had just swooped into the room. The largest of these birds, a huge, stately eagle owl, dropped a thick red envelope into Sirius's plate. He looked down at it, then up at McGonagall with a wry smile. "I think they know exactly where I am." He picked up the ominous envelope and, without breaking eye contact with McGonagall, ripped it open. Almost immediately the letter began to shriek. The voice was so loud that it filled the entire hall, causing heads to turn. McGonagall winced at the ear-splitting pitch of it. It was the voice of Sirius's mother. "Sirius Orion Black!" it shrieked. "How dare you defy your father in this manner?" Remus covered his ears. Sirius remained perfectly still, looking up at McGonagall. "Consorting with half-breeds and blood traitors, turning your back on your family. If your grandfather was alive, he'd have you disowned the moment you were sorted. You will remain at school until the end of the year, and think about the shame and dishonour you have brought to your noble title. Don't think we won't disinherit you. You are not our only son." With that, the letter burst into flames, curling and shrivelling into a pile of chalk-white ash. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone was staring. Sirius reached for some toast, put it on his plate, then began ladling scrambled egg onto it, nonchalantly. He glanced up at McGonagall again. "You can send Mother an owl if you like, Professor, but I doubt she'll read it." "Very well, Sirius," McGonagall nodded. "Just try to keep out of trouble, will you?" With that she walked away stiffly, back to the teacher's table at the far end of the hall. Sirius ate his breakfast in silence. Years later, Remus would always remember thinking in that moment that Sirius Black must be the bravest boy in the world. Aww. Christmas Day at St. Edmund's was usually an extremely noisy affair. Boys got presents delivered, those with distant relatives who cared enough to send a few sweatshirts perhaps, but not enough to visit. Others made do with the usual selection of donations from the locals, which Matron had wrapped up for them. Gift-getting was quickly followed by gift-swapping, and they often passed the morning bartering and trading with meagre items they'd received. They were made to smarten themselves up, then led in a long line to the church where they would sit through Christmas service, bored and slouching. Christmas morning at Hogwarts was a good deal more pleasant. Remus was almost touched to find that Matron had not forgotten him. The post had arrived overnight, and at the end of his bed he found a card from her, as well as a lumpy package which contained a bag of nuts, an orange, and a tin of biscuits. To his amazement, James had also sent a present, his very own set of gobstones. Peter had even sent a box of chocolate frogs. "Merry Christmas," Sirius yawned, opening his own gifts. He had nothing from his parents, as far as Remus could see, but didn't mention it. James had sent him an annual of his favourite Quidditch team, the Southend Scorchers, and he had a box of frogs from Peter too. "Merry Christmas," Remus returned. "I didn't get anyone any presents," he admitted guiltily. "I didn't know they would." "Don't worry about it," Sirius replied on his way to the bathroom. "No one expected you to." This troubled Remus, but he tried not to think about it. While Sirius was in the loo, another owl flew in the window and dropped a large, flat, square package on his bed. When Sirius came out and saw it, his eyes lit up and he ripped it open, eagerly. "It's from Andromeda!" he explained, pulling the record out, showing it to Remus, who hurried over excitedly. It was another Muggle album. The cover was black, printed with the silhouetted image of a man standing in front of a huge amplifier playing a guitar. He had long, wildly curly hair, stood with his legs apart in a power stance, outlined in gold. Electric Warrior, the title blared. T-Rex. Oh, T-Rex, I think I've heard of them, Remus said as Sirius flipped it over to read the track listing. Stick it on, Remus encouraged, impatient. Who cared what the cover said? Sirius did, sliding out the slick black disc and settling it on his turntable. The record began to turn, and the room filled with music, a smooth sliding throb. Beneath the bee-hop moon, I want to croon with you. Ooh. They sat and listened, entranced, stopping only to flip to the B-side. Once it was over, Sirius wordlessly turned it over and began at the beginning again. They alternated between sitting on the bed, swaying slightly to the melody, or nodding their heads as the beats quickened. They shared grins with each other at the catchiest riffs, and lay down to stare at the ceiling for the slower, dreamier tracks. Eventually, halfway through the second listen, Frank came in. "Merry Christmas, lads! Come on, breakfast!" They dressed quickly and went down to the dining hall. The great hall had been decorated garishly by the teachers. Glittering ropes of tinsel in red, green, and gold sparkled from every rafter, hanging down like festive jungle vines. 12 enormous trees twinkled with lights in every corner imaginable, and baubles the size of footballs hung from every branch. After breakfast, the boys ran upstairs to listen to the album again. "This is the coolest thing I've ever heard," Remus declared. Sirius nodded solemnly. Sirius's favorite song was Jeepster. He loved the twanging chords, the aggressive thump of it. Remus liked Monolith best. It was spacey and smooth, the words both nonsensical and meaningful at the same time. It made him feel like he was floating. For the rest of the day, they played the music in the common room, ate their way through the chocolate frogs, nuts and biscuits, and played rowdy games of exploding snap. Meals at Hogwarts were always spectacular, and Christmas dinner was no different. By the time night had fallen, Remus had eaten so much he thought he might never be hungry again. Though he didn't say it to Sirius, who, after all, had been forced to run away from home for the first, if not the last time, it was Remus's best Christmas ever. Chapter 13. First Year. Lectuuncula Magna. Tuesday, 27th of December, 1971. With Boxing Day over and done with, Remus and Sirius found themselves caught in those strange nowhere days between Christmas Day and New Year's Day, as they awaited their friend's return. Sirius was keen to plan their revenge on Snape. In fact, he was no longer interested in attacking all the Slytherins anymore, wanting to focus his energies on one single nemesis. Remus was inclined to agree. He'd been too furious with Snape to think clearly about it for the past few weeks. He couldn't shake the feeling that Severus had somehow hit upon the exact hex that would cause Remus the most upset. He didn't know quite how the Slytherin boy had managed it, and it was very likely just a clever guess, but he didn't care. "We could just get James's cloak, follow him until he's alone, then beat the shit out of him," Remus growled, as they sat in the empty common room one evening. He gripped the arm of the settee as he said this, feeling the leather creak under his grasp. It was getting close to the full moon, and his temper was closer to the surface than usual. Now, Lupin," Sirius chastised smoothly, carrying a pile of books he'd brought from the library. "You're thinking like a muggle. If we're gonna get him, we're gonna get him with magic." "Not more books," Remus whined as Sirius plopped down beside him, an enormous tome in his arms. He opened it, and it was so big that the cover rested across both of their skinny legs. "Yes, more books," Sirius replied breezily. "You'll love them once you get to know them, I promise." Remus wasn't so sure about that. It was true he'd grown to quite like their secret study sessions and had been privately amazed at the amount he'd learned. But listening to Sirius was one thing. Sitting down alone and staring at a block of text was quite another thing altogether. Still, Sirius kept promising him that he was getting closer to a solution. "So what's this about?" Remus asked, resigned to his fate. If Sirius wanted to do something, there was very little anyone could do to stop him. You just had to hold on tight until it was over. Hexes and jinxes. A lot of them are really complex, though. I mean, we're good. You, me, and James, anyway. But I think we should still stick to the basics. Simplicity is key. Okay, Remus replied dully. He still preferred the idea of a surprise beating. So I thought we could brainstorm all the stuff we can do and see if it lends itself to any good jinxes, Sirius continued, undeterred by Remus's reluctance. So I'm really good at transfiguration. I got the best marks even after you started catching up. Right, Remus agreed. James is a bit better than me at defense against the dark arts, which you'd think would be helpful when dealing with a slimy creep like Snivellus, but we haven't really learnt any good spells yet, except disarming stuff. And that's no use. He chewed the nib of his quill, considering. It wasn't a new quill, and left a dark stain on Sirius's bottom lip. Remus didn't say anything. Sirius carried on. James is good at flying too, obviously. But I don't know if that's going to be any help. Then there's Pete. Good at sneaking around and grunt work, I suppose. Remus thought that was rather unfair. Peter was never top of the class like Sirius and James, but he was generally perfectly competent, usually settling for a satisfactory mark. He lacked the competitive edge James and Sirius had, the desire to prove himself. Remus recognized this well enough. It was enough to just be friends with cleverer, more confident people sometimes. You got a bit of their shine with none of the pressure. Pete's good at herbology, Remus pointed out, and potions. Both useless, Sirius shrugged. You were the one who came up with the rosehip thing, and we're never going to best Snape at potions. I hate to admit it, but the bastard's too good. Anyway, you're probably best at charms. Not best, Remus said hurriedly. I'm good at levitation, I suppose, but that's it. Oh, shut up. There's no time for modesty, Lupin. Sirius waved an impatient hand. You pick up spells quicker than anyone. If we find a sufficiently hideous hex in there, I'm counting on you to figure out how to do it. Remus squirmed. He hated when Sirius talked like that, as if Remus was as clever or as gifted as he and James were. He knew it wasn't true, and it embarrassed him. He fought a sudden urge to push the big heavy book off their laps and walk away. It was just the full moon, he told himself. He felt fidgety and too hot by the fire, too close to Sirius, whose blood he could smell, mixed in with the unique scent of magic. He vaguely hoped that dinner would be red meat, something he could taste the iron in. It has to be something big, Sirius murmured, flipping all the way to the back of the book. Remus let out a yelp as the full weight of it thudded against his thighs. Sirius ignored this, running a finger down the index. Something much worse than the hair thing. Remus shuddered at the thought of Snape's prank. Rage surged up in him again. Or was it hunger? He shook his head, pushing the book away and getting up, pretending he'd just had to stretch. His joints ached already as his body prepared for the coming transformation. I don't know why you think I'll be any help, Remus sighed, yawning now. Muggle insight, Sirius grinned. Like the itching powder, you can come up with stuff Snape won't see coming. Remus scratched his head, racking his brain. I can't think of anything bad enough, he said. Once we got a bucket of water and propped it over a door, which you have to leave a bit ajar, you know. Then Matron was supposed to walk through and get soaked. Except Matron didn't walk through, the cook did, and we all got served shit food for a month. His stomach growled at the mention of food. It's a pretty tame prank, to be honest. Are you hungry? Can we go down for dinner yet? Yeah, I suppose. Sirius closed the book. We could get a bucket pretty easily, but it seems there's a lot of room for error, and I don't know if it really struck fear into his heart the way we want it. We're marauders. We should be setting certain standards. Remus chuckled as they climbed through the portrait hole. Yeah, I told you it was rubbish. Shame, 'cause Snivellus could do with a good wash. Sirius laughed back. Then he froze and gripped Remus's shoulder. Oh, you genius! You bloody genius! What? Remus replied, shocked and a bit annoyed to be shaken about like that. A good wash! That's what we'll do. It's easy, I bet. I'll be back with one of those books. Wait here! He disappeared through the portrait. Remus sighed, hungrily, and waited. So wait, explain it to me again, Remus whispered as they finished their plates. He used the remains of his roast potato to mop up what remained of the gravy. He might have seconds. He ate like a horse on the nights before the moon. It sounds complicated. It isn't. Sirius shook his head. I reckon it's easy. Weather spells are hard on a grand scale, but this one only needs to be the cloud the size of the plate. He tapped the porcelain in front of him. Would it be like the ceiling? Remus asked, jerking his head up at the charmed rafters. It was raining, as it had been all Christmas, but the downpour vanished before it reached them. A bit, Sirius replied, but smaller, without whatever charms are stopping us from getting wet. But couldn't he just step away from it? Not if we combine it with a binding spell. But we can't mix spells yet. Well, I can't. Can you? He looked up at Sirius, who was nodding vigorously. Yeah, I've been having a go at it, for your reading thing. It's actually not too hard. You just have to concentrate. That's what they say about reading. Remus sighed. We'll practice, Sirius said firmly. We'll practice loads. Before James and Pete get back, they'll be dead impressed. There was no time for seconds after that, so Remus had to satisfy himself with the remainder of his Christmas biscuits as Sirius looked up weather charms. Once he'd found what he wanted, they took it both in turns to have a go, Sirius reading out the directions several times before they understood them. It was the first time Remus had attempted a spell without having it demonstrated for him first. Daunting to begin with, he quickly understood how the wand movement ought to flow and twist, while Sirius was best at pronunciation. It did take a lot of concentration. It was nearly midnight by the time either of them had produced anything at all. Finally, Remus managed to cast a small grey cloud. It poured from his wand like smoke, then hovered between them for a few moments before bursting like a bubble, leaving only a faint trace of condensation. Sirius grinned broadly. This is gonna work! Saturday, 31st of December, 1971. It was hard to shake off Sirius on the night of the full moon. Remus even told him he was feeling sick, but then the other boy wanted to accompany him to the hospital wing. Eventually he managed to convince him that he ought to stay behind and keep practicing the rain cloud charm. We've basically got it now, though, Sirius complained. It was true. They'd both managed to produce satisfactory miniature rainstorms. The bathroom had almost flooded in the process. It was just a matter of maintaining concentration and perfecting the binding aspect now. Find something else to do, Remus snapped, halfway out the door, skin crawling, stomach growling. I'll see you tomorrow. How do you know she'll keep you of enough? Remus had escaped before having to answer any more questions. He was getting careless, he thought to himself, as he knocked on McGonagall's office door. Eventually he'd have to think of a decent excuse for all his absences. They were sure to connect the nights he vanished to the full moon. Eventually, they all did astronomy together. The shack was cold, the walls damp from the relentless rain. Remus wished he'd brought his wand. He'd learnt to cast a good fire charm now, but he supposed it would be no good if there was a fire blazing when he turned. He might burn the whole place down. The transformation came on more suddenly than usual. Ever since Madame Pomfrey had told him they would get worse, he seemed to feel it more. He still fought not to scream, worried that McGonagall and Pomfrey might hear him on their way out of the tunnel. He didn't need any more pity. Sunday, 1st of January, 1972. The next day, Remus could barely get up after he'd changed back. He pulled a blanket round himself instead and lay on the floor waiting for Madame Pomfrey to arrive. Every inch of him hurt, more than ever. His head pounded as if a troll had stomped on it. Every tooth in his jaw ached. The tendons in his shoulders felt as if they'd been stretched so far they'd snapped. He'd broken almost all of his fingernails. There were huge claw marks in the wallpaper. Remus! Madame Pomfrey's soft voice came through the door. "I'm coming in now, dear." He closed his eyes, unable to even groan. "Oh," she said as she entered the room and found him on the floor. "That one, was it? Perhaps it's the solstice. I'll have to consult my books. Can you get up, Remus?" She touched his forehead with the back of her hand. He opened his eyes and nodded weakly, taking her arm and hauling himself up. That was a mistake. As soon as he was on his feet, his head swam and his stomach lurched. He bent forward and vomited on the floor. "Never mind," Madame Pomfrey said, kindly, an arm around his trembling shoulder. She pointed her wand at the mass, and it vanished in an instant. "No harm done. Let's get you somewhere warm now, shall we?" She wanted to magic a stretcher to carry him back to the castle, but he wouldn't bear the shame of it, no matter how early in the morning it was. They walked back very slowly and up to the hospital wing, where he finally collapsed into a soft, clean bed. The nurse continued to fuss about him, but he was already drifting to sleep. He woke up feeling marginally better. His headache had left him anyway. He blinked blearily, reaching for the glass of water beside him. Someone picked it up and handed it to him. He drank deeply, then set it down, looking up, expecting to see Madame Pomfrey. He jumped. "Sirius!" he rasped, his throat still sore. God, had he actually been howling? How embarrassing. "Happy New Year!" Sirius said cheerily. He was sitting on the little wooden stool put there for visitors, clutching a book to his chest. "Thought I'd come looking when you weren't at breakfast. You all right?" "Fine," Remus said, sitting up, hurriedly rubbing his head. I get migraines sometimes. I'm feeling better." "Good," Sirius nodded, "because I've got your Christmas present ready." "My what?" Remus stared at Sirius warily. His blue eyes were bright and full of mischief. "Sorry it's late," he was saying. "I had a few last-minute tweaks to make. Here." He handed over the book. It was Remus's copy of A History of Magic. "What?" Remus wasn't sure if he was just having a very odd dream. Why was Sirius giving him his very own history book? "Open it!" Remus did. He had hardly opened the book all year, and the pages were stiff and immaculate except for the very first page. Below the title, Sirius had written something in his very own neat cursive handwriting. Remus squinted at it, his mouth twisting with effort. He was already exhausted, and he didn't have the energy for riddles. "Sirius," he sighed, "you know I can't—" "Put your hand on it," Sirius said eagerly, stepping forward. "Palm flat against the page. Yeah, like that. Now, give me a moment." He withdrew his wand from his pocket and placed the point exactly against Remus's temple. "Sirius, what are you doing?" Remus was alarmed. He'd never had a wand pointed at him before, and he'd seen Sirius blow up bigger things than his head. "Trust me," Sirius shushed him. A look of concentration came over his face. He took a deep breath. Remus squeezed his eyes shut, preparing for the worst. At least he was already in the hospital wing. "Lectio nuclea magna," Sirius said forcefully. Remus felt an odd jolt, as if he'd missed the last step on a staircase. It hadn't hurt exactly, and at least his head was still attached. He opened his eyes and looked at Sirius. "What was that?" "Look at the book," Sirius pointed, practically dancing on the spot with excitement. "Tell me what it says." Remus sighed and looked down at the book in his lap. It was exactly the same. A blank white page with Sirius's slightly slanted, thick black handwriting. He stared at it, not sure what he was supposed to be doing. "Read it," Sirius prompted. Remus looked down and looked at the first word. "Happy," a voice in his head said. Remus blinked in shock. He'd never heard the voice before, though it sounded like him. It was almost like the Sorting Hat, only more familiar, less invasive. He looked again. "Happy Christmas," it read. "Now you can do your own bloody homework, from your fellow marauder and friend, Sirius Black." Remus laughed. He looked at Sirius, then back at the page. He split the book open to a middle page, looking at the words printed there. During the late 16th century, Cornelius Agrippa made his greatest advancements in the field of natural magic. Oh my God! Remus exclaimed. He flipped a page again and read more. The voice continued confidently. He could read. Oh my God! It worked then? Sirius asked, beaming. Sirius, this is... You... I can't... How? Oh no, Sirius chuckled. Don't tell me I've messed up your brain so much you can't even form a coherent sentence. Thank you, was all Remus could say. He could feel his eyes stinging with tears and immediately rubbed them hard with his fists. Sirius looked away politely. It's okay, he replied. Now you can help me research our next big prank. We haven't even got the first one off the ground yet, Remus replied, sniffing hard, pulling himself together. You have to show me how you did this. It must be really advanced magic. Sort of, Sirius shrugged. I got the idea after Mother's Howler, actually. I thought if you could get a letter to scream at someone, then you could get a book to read to someone. Keeping the voice in your head was the hardest part. I couldn't tell if it was working on me or if I was just reading normally. Works on any book, though, I think. Not sure about any of the other stuff, though, like potion labels or signs, but we can keep working on it. Remus couldn't stop staring at the book, reading random lines and grinning to himself. He didn't think he'd ever been so happy in his life. Chapter 14. First year. The prank. Sunday, 2nd of January, 1972. Brilliant! James exclaimed, slamming his hand down on the bathroom counter. Completely brilliant! You're so clever, Peter gushed. The four of them were crammed in the small shared bathroom. Sirius was standing in the bath, fully dressed, holding an umbrella over his head, while Remus pointed his wand at a grey storm cloud hovering just above it. It was pouring rain. Sirius shuffled up and down the tub, but the cloud stayed firmly above his head, following his every move. James and Peter had arrived back from their Christmas holidays only 2 hours ago, and as soon as dinner was over, Remus and Sirius had dragged them upstairs for a demonstration. Lupin gave me the idea, but I looked up the charms to do it, Sirius beamed proudly. He won't know what's hit him. When can we do it? James was jumping up and down now, ready to explode with excitement. First thing tomorrow? Breakfast? Potions? Dinner, Sirius shook his head. More of an audience. Yes, dinner, James nodded wisely, as if the idea had been his own. Seriously, you two. I'm so bloody proud. Cheers. Sirius raised an ironic eyebrow. Then he looked at Remus. Lupin, you can probably stop now. My feet are getting wet. Oh! Remus shook off the charm, seeing that he had produced more rain than the ancient plug hole could manage, and Sirius was now ankle-deep in cold water, the bottom of his robes soaked. Sorry. It's fine, Sirius laughed, stepping out of the bath and squeezing out his robes. Just make sure you do the same to Snape. So Lupin's doing this one? James asked. Sirius shrugged. He's better at it. I can do it too, though, if we get interference. Monday, 3rd of January, 1972. The first day of lessons after Christmas was a very strange one. James, Sirius, and Peter were full of nervous energy in anticipation of the practical joke. Remus was looking forward to that too, though somewhat nervous as it was he who had to pull it off. But he had another reason to be excited. It would be the first day of school in his entire academic career that he would be able to read. Sirius had shown him how to perform the spell, and it was very difficult. In the end, Remus just had the other boy perform it for him most of the time, deciding to devote more time to learning how to do it himself later. His magic was still slightly wonky following the full moon, liable to overreach and go off if he concentrated too hard. It didn't seem like a good idea to turn his wand on himself until the moon waned enough and he had more control. The first half of the day was everything he'd hoped it might be. He couldn't read the blackboard, but charms was mostly practice-based, and it amazed Remus how much easier everything became when he could just consult his text without having to remember everything Flitwick had said about softing charms. He was the first in the class to get his brick to bounce, much to the consternation of Lily Evans, who was usually the top charm student. It was in the afternoon during potions that things began to go awry. It began with Slughorn returning their essays on the 12 uses of dragon's blood. Remus had completed his before Christmas with help from Sirius, and the Marauders as a whole did fairly well. As usual, Snape got the highest mark and earned 5 points for Slytherin. Lily was second and got a point for Gryffindor. She'd only beaten Sirius by a few marks. None of this was at all out of the ordinary, but apparently the tension of anticipation had grown too much for Sirius, and he couldn't resist getting a shot in. "Wonder if it's worth cozying up to Snivellus for just one measly house point," he grumbled, loud enough for Lily and Snape to hear. Lily spun round, 2 bright pink patches on her cheeks. "Shut up, Black," she hissed. "No one likes a sore loser." "Hardly losing when your boyfriend lets you copy his work," Sirius whispered back venomously. "I do not copy him, and Severus is not my boyfriend." Lily's face was getting redder. "You're blushing, Evans," Sirius smirked, pleased with himself. He nudged James. "Isn't that sweet?" James sniggered, nodding along. "Ignore them, Lily," Snape whispered, without turning his head. "They're just jealous." "Jealous of what, Snivellus?" James jumped in, still trying to keep his voice down. "Jealous of a slimy, greasy git like you? Keep dreaming." Sirius laughed, pleased to have drawn James in. Peter laughed too, so as not to be left out. Slughorn was still oblivious, now with his back turned to the class as he scribbled instructions on the blackboard. Severus finally turned in his chair. He turned his beady black eyes on Sirius. "I hear you had a very quiet Christmas, Black," he said, his voice low and full of danger. "Your family couldn't stand to have you around for more than a few days before packing you back off to school. Is that right?" His lips curled cruelly. "All of the pure-blood families are talking about it. The Black's black sheep." Sirius clenched his fists. Remus saw his knuckles turn white. "Shut your face," Sirius growled through gritted teeth. "Yeah, you better watch it, Snape." James was frowning. "You better be careful what you say. Never know what might happen." "Is that a threat, Potter?" Snape replied, sounding bored. "Forgive me if I'm not quaking in my boots. Going to set Loony Lupin on me again?" Remus, who'd been half listening to the posturing and half listening to Slughorn's instructions, flinched involuntarily. He'd had that nickname before. It was actually impressive that no one in Hogwarts hadn't said it yet, especially when he knew he had a reputation for being a bit odd. Had everyone been calling him that behind his back? Reflexively, he picked up his wand. Snape saw, and his smirk grew even meaner. "Oh my. Have you actually learned some magic, Lupin? I'm impressed. Mind you, I've heard they can train some monkeys to perform basic tricks, so I suppose it's no real achievement." Remus raised his wand, but Sirius grabbed his wrist and pushed it down on the desk. "Not yet," he muttered. Remus clenched his jaw and looked back at the blackboard, seething internally. Snape chuckled and turned away too. Remus heard Lily whisper angrily, "There's no need to be so horrid to him." Remus could barely concentrate on the rest of the lesson. He knew he shouldn't care what Snape thought of him, or anyone for that matter, but the Slytherin boy's barbs dug in and couldn't be shaken loose. Sirius didn't help. He kept murmuring, "We'll show him," under his breath, throwing dark looks in Snape's direction. By the time dinner rolled round, Remus was white-hot with rage and the desire to prove himself. He barely ate a thing, and it was shepherd's pie, one of his favourites. He glared at Snape from across the room. This did not go unnoticed, and Severus nudged the boys around him, pointing at the Marauders and laughing. Remus thought he could make out the words, "Loony Lupin." James and Sirius scowled at them too. Lily noticed too. "You lot just leave Sev alone, okay?" she squeaked. "This stupid fight is going to go on forever if none of you can be mature enough to—" "Give it a rest, Evans," James rolled his eyes. Bad enough you have to be friends with the tosser. Now you're trying to defend him? Where's your house loyalty, eh? This has nothing to do with houses, she snapped. It's a ridiculous spat over nothing. He insulted Remus. You pick on him all the time. He started it. Oh, so you've got to finish it then, Potter? She stood up suddenly, picking up her bag. God, you're so full of yourselves. She walked away, her patent shoes clicking angrily on the flagstones. Loves a fight, that one, James grinned. There was a yelp of laughter from the Slytherin table, and Remus decided he'd had enough. He stood up too, pulled up his wand and pointed it at Severus. Legare pluvium! It was instantaneous and perfectly glorious. The rain cloud shot from Remus's wand with the speed of a bullet, so no one could even see where it had come from. It rested over Snape's head, thick, grey and heavy. There was a low roll of thunder, and the downpour began. He didn't know it was happening at first, covering his head with his hands and looking up. The students sitting on either side of Snape stood up and backed away, not wanting to get wet. Then Snape stood up, trying to dodge the cloud, but it followed him, hovering persistently, rain bucketing down. People were laughing now and pointing. Everyone was looking round, trying to see who'd done it, but no one had seen Remus cast it except his friends. He sat back down, but kept his wand trained on Severus, grinning as he watched the boy still trying to run away from the mini-storm. Yes, Sirius hissed in his ear. Bloody yes, Lupin, you beauty. The immense satisfaction Remus felt was compounded by the laughter echoing round him. Snape was such a nasty, spiteful boy. Even some of the Slytherins looked pleased to see him get what he deserved. The more Remus thought about it, the more he wanted to punish him, and the harder it rained. In fact, the clouds seemed to darken and swell. Snape was completely soaked now, his hair plastered to his head, getting in his eyes. His skin was pale and his robes shining with water, a puddle forming beneath him. Remus grinned as he watched Severus try desperately to escape, looking more and more like a drowned rat. Lily was screeching at James. I know it's you! Stop it now! James kept laughing and held up his hands to show that he wasn't doing anything. Lily looked close to tears. Severus made to run, arms over his head to stop the rain pelting him, but his robes were so heavy and so waterlogged that he half tripped, half slid and collapsed to the floor. Remus would have laughed, but his concentration deepened. The rain fell harder still until it was difficult to even see Severus through the grey sheets. The cloud was bigger too, and crackling with thunder and lightning. It had never done that when he'd practiced on Sirius. But then he hadn't been angry at Sirius. Stop it, please! Lily was sobbing now. James had stopped laughing. He touched Remus's arm. Remus, he's had enough, mate. Snape wasn't getting up. Remus realized that no one was laughing anymore, and a few people were screaming. Finite! A voice boomed over the dining hall. At once the rain stopped. Everyone was silent. Dumbledore stood in the entranceway. Remus hadn't seen him since Halloween. He looked perfectly calm despite the chaos that had just ended. The headmaster swept into the room, vanishing all the water with a wave of his wand, and bending over Severus. Remus put away his wand and shrank to his seat, watching Dumbledore whispering over Snape's prone body. Lily was still sobbing and ran over to stand beside Dumbledore, trembling and frightened. Everyone to your dormitories, please. Dumbledore spoke quietly, but was somehow heard by everyone in the huge hall. Miss Evans, please fetch Madame Pomfrey. Lily ran from the room, and the other students began to file out obediently. James, Sirius, and Remus all shot nervous glances at each other before hurrying to join the rest of their house. Chapter 15. First Year. Aftermath. Most of the Gryffindors hung round in the common room, gossiping and chattering, all wondering who could have done it. The Marauders, usually keen to be at the centre of any debate, all crept upstairs, pale-faced with guilt. Remus sat on his bed, staring at the floor. He had gone too far. He knew that. It had felt good for a little while, and nothing could convince him that Severus hadn't deserved it. But now James was looking at him oddly, and he knew that Dumbledore would find out somehow. if Lily didn't tell everyone as soon as she got back to the common room. "What happened?" James asked carefully. "Did you lose control of it? That was really strong magic."
"It was amazing," Sirius said suddenly. "He'll think twice before crossing us again."
"But, I mean, we didn't want to hurt him, did we?" James frowned.
"He's fine. He was just pretending to get us in trouble."
"Will we get in trouble?" Peter asked, wringing his hands. "We didn't all do it, did we? It was only—" Sirius slapped him round the back of his head.
"You rat," he said. "We're marauders, all for one and one for all."
"Whatever that means," Peter muttered, rubbing his head and going to sit on his own bed sulkily.
"I did it. You lot shouldn't get in trouble," Remus said quietly, not looking up. "It was half my idea," Sirius said. "I did the research. Don't worry, Lupin. I'll bet you anything he's fine."
"If he is," Remus said heavily,
"then it's no thanks to me."
He finally met James's eyes. They were deep brown and more serious than usual.
"I did mean to hurt him."
James held his gaze and nodded slightly. There was a knock at the door, diffusing the tension. It was Frank Longbottom. "You four are to go to McGonagall's office now," he said gravely. They followed Frank down the stairs and through the common room where everyone stared at them. Remus looked at his feet the whole time, but he heard the chatter go quiet as they walked through. It didn't matter what happened next. Everyone would know they were responsible. McGonagall was not alone. Dumbledore stood beside her desk, his hands folded in front of him. He smiled pleasantly at the four boys who stood in a line before him.
"Good evening, gentlemen," he said.
"Good evening, Headmaster," they all chanted back.
"You may be interested to know that young Mr. Snape is quite well, though his pride has been rather wounded."
They said nothing. Remus didn't look up.
"He seemed to think that you four had something to do with his misfortune,"
Dumbledore continued pleasantly, as if he was just passing the time of day.
"Particularly you, Mr. Potter."
James looked up, opened his mouth, then closed it again and looked down. Remus couldn't bear it. He only had 3 friends in the whole world, and he wasn't going to lose them now. He stepped forward.
"It was me, sir. I did it. He said some stuff to me earlier, and I was pissed off with him. I wanted to teach him a lesson."
He forced himself to look up into Dumbledore's pale blue eyes. The old man nodded, satisfied.
"I see. You acted alone?" "Yes."
Remus pulled out his wand.
"Look, I can prove it."
"No need," Dumbledore said hurriedly.
"I believe you, Mr. Lupin." "It wasn't just him, sir," Sirius burst out. "I looked up the spell. I learned how to do it. It's just as much my fault."
"You mean you planned this, Black?" McGonagall said sharply. "You planned an attack on another pupil? 10 points from Gryffindor, each." Sirius looked down again. "And detention for all of you for a month," she continued. "I find it very hard to believe that Mr. Lupin here acted alone." All 4 of them hung their heads.
"You may go, gentlemen," Dumbledore said quietly. "I have no doubt you will all take time to apologize to Mr. Snape, of course."
Sirius made an indignant noise, and James elbowed him roughly. They turned to leave.
"Mr. Lupin, just a moment."
Remus froze. He should have known he wouldn't get away with it that easily. He stood still as the others left the room, McGonagall following them out to make sure they didn't loiter outside. Once the door closed, a still silence fell. Dumbledore didn't speak immediately, and finally Remus raised his head to meet the headmaster's eyes. He didn't look angry or disappointed. He wore his usual pleasant expression, tinged with curiosity, perhaps.
"How have you been finding Hogwarts, Remus?"
That wasn't the question he'd anticipated.
Okay, I suppose. You seem to have had no problem making friends."
That wasn't a question at all, so he didn't answer it. He looked at his feet, then back up.
"Am I getting expelled?"
he asked. Dumbledore smiled.
"No, Remus, no one is getting expelled. I can see that you're sorry for what you've done. The thing that concerns me is how you did it. That is a very strong spell. I wouldn't have expected a first year to... You must have been very angry." Remus nodded. He didn't want to tell Dumbledore why, about the names Snape called him, or how he made him feel stupid and worthless and small. Passion is an important quality in a wizard, Remus, Dumbledore was saying. It directs our magic, strengthens it. But as you learned today, if we do not exercise control, then we endanger everyone around us. He looked very serious. His eyes had lost their twinkle. I do not wish to frighten you, Remus. When we first met, I told you I sympathized with you. The hand you'd been dealt is not one I would wish on anyone. But you must be more careful. You are a gifted wizard. Do not waste it. Remus nodded, wanting more than anything for the conversation to be over. He'd rather have the cane than a lecture. The worst part was that Dumbledore was right. He'd let his anger towards Severus influence the spell he used. He just wasn't used to having that kind of strength. I'm sorry, Professor, he said. Is Severus okay? Yes, he's perfectly fine. I think he was hoping that if he simply stopped struggling, then whoever was casting the spell would stop. He's been dried off and won't suffer any long-term effects. Oh, Remus nodded. Good. Now, Dumbledore smiled, off you go. I've kept you long enough, and I have a feeling that Mr. Potter is waiting outside for you to tell him everything. Dumbledore had given him a lot to think about, and he'd had plenty of time to think. McGonagall was deadly serious about their detentions, and even went so far as to split the four of them up. Sirius was tasked with scrubbing cauldrons in the dungeons, Peter was polishing the trophies in the awards room, and James with reconfiguring every astronomy telescope in the tower. Remus was given the worst task of all, mucking out the owlry. Of course, none of them were permitted to use their wands, and every night they had to begin all over again. Cruel and unusual is what it is, Peter complained at the end of the first week as they fell into bed, filthy and exhausted. I know what you're moaning about, Sirius grumbled. I'd love to polish trophies. Who knows what I've caught scraping out those crusty potions from the bottom of those bloody cauldrons. James just groaned, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. Remus did not complain because he didn't feel he deserved to. He felt terrible for getting all his friends into trouble, and even more terrible for what he'd done. This was only exacerbated by the amount of reading he'd been doing. Sirius's spell was difficult, less intuitive than the magic he was used to. Sirius was the first to admit it wasn't perfect. It wore off after an hour or so and had to be repeated. Remus had just about mastered it enough to perform it alone, though it often took him a few goes before he got it right. The very first thing he'd done was visit the library and borrowed a book from the magical creatures shelves. Every night, after they'd done their homework and served their detentions, Remus would draw the curtains round his bed, light his wand, and read the same chapter over and over. There were entire books written on his particular problem, he'd found, but he was terrified that someone would become suspicious if he started checking them all out. Plus, he wasn't sure he wanted to know any more. The things he'd read so far were bad enough. He thought about the book almost constantly, in his lessons, at mealtimes, during detention. Words like monstrous, deadly, and darkest of creatures flashed in his mind like neon signs. He'd known that he was dangerous, of course. He'd known that he was different. He hadn't known that he was hated. Hunted, even. Apparently his teeth were worth thousands in certain parts of Eastern Europe. His pelt was worth even more. There were the legislative details, too, things he didn't fully understand which sounded horrible. Employment laws and registries and travel restrictions. It seemed that even if he could read that his job prospects might be no better in the wizarding world than they were as a muggle. He also understood why Dumbledore told him to be careful. It was clear now that if anyone at Hogwarts found out what Remus was, then he might be in real trouble, and expulsion would be the least of his concerns. Frustratingly, nothing he read was really relevant to his experiences. There was no account of a wizard actually living with the condition, how they managed, what to expect, whether they'd been able to hold down a job or even just avoid hurting others. He assumed it was normal that he could smell blood and hear heartbeats. But how could he know for sure? Was it normal that his magic was stronger when the moon was rising? Sometimes he thought he could feel the sheer power of it, fizzing in his veins like a potion, filling him up and spilling over, bursting from his fingertips. And then there was his temper. How much of that was him, and how much of it was the monster? He lay awake most nights after the reading spell had worn off, and he was too tired to cast it again, but too restless to sleep. His mind whirred with worry and fear. How simple everything had seemed back at St. Edmund's. No magic, no homework, no agonizing moral dilemmas, and of course no friends. If anything stopped Remus from just giving up, then it was that. It was James who had the ego the size of the lake, but a heart to match it. Peter, who, yes, granted was weird and a bit clueless, and actually had a wicked sense of humour and could be unfailingly generous. And of course Sirius. Sirius could keep secrets, had a mean streak but never directed it at his friends, was the most gifted student in the year but spent all his time coming up with pranks instead. Remus wasn't going to give up any of that, not if he could help it. Even if he had to be the swottiest student in the school, if he had to force himself to read every book, complete every assignment, follow every rule, he'd be so good they wouldn't know what hit them, so good they'd have to make him a prefect. He'd do it all, if it meant staying at Hogwarts and keeping his friends. There was nobody to talk to about any of these things. No one who would understand, anyway. As far as Remus knew, only Dumbledore, McGonagall, and Madame Pomfrey knew about his condition. McGonagall was too severe to approach with questions like that. Remus still wasn't sure that Dumbledore was entirely sane, and anyway he had no idea how to make an appointment with the headmaster. So it had to be Madame Pomfrey in the end. He waited until the next moon, which came at the end of January. It was a Sunday, so after dinner he separated himself from the marauders and headed to the hospital wing earlier than usual. "Remus!" She smiled at him, surprised. "I didn't expect you until nightfall." "I wanted to ask you some stuff," he said, shyly, eyes darting round the room. There were a few students lying in beds, most of them sleeping. Fortunately, Madame Pomfrey was very discreet. "Certainly. Shall we pop into my office?" It was much nicer than any of the teachers' offices Remus had been in so far. The walls were lined with hundreds of neat and orderly bottles of potions and tonics. It was light and airy. She didn't have a desk, and instead of wooden seats, there were comfortable armchairs seated on either side of a fireplace. "How can I help, dear?" she asked, settling in, gesturing that he sit down. "Well," he swallowed, not sure how to begin. I had a few questions about my condition." She smiled at him kindly. "Of course you do, Remus. That's perfectly natural. Is there something specific you'd like to know?" "Yeah, I did a bit of reading. I know there isn't a cure or anything." "Not yet," she said quickly. "Advancements are being made all the time." "Oh, okay. Well, for now, I suppose I just want to know more about it. I don't remember anything when I wake up, just that I get really hungry." "You'd like to know more about the transformation?" "No, not just that. Stuff like, does it change who I am the rest of the time? Does it make me—" He looked down at his hands, at a loss. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say, and there was a lump in his throat. "Remus," Madame Pomfrey said, "this is a condition you have. It's not who you are." "I get angry sometimes," he said, staring into the fire rather than looking her in the face. "I get really, really angry." "Everyone has emotions. That's perfectly natural. We just have to learn to control them over time." He nodded, taking this in. He couldn't tell her the rest. "When I change, it's getting worse. Harder." "Yes," she replied solemnly. "I did read that it can get worse with the onset of puberty." "Oh, okay," Remus nodded. There was a long pause. "How much worse?" I couldn't say. You really are the first of your kind that I've treated." Another silence. Remus felt no better than he had before, no less confused. "Would you like to borrow that book I mentioned?" He nodded, finally bringing himself to look up at her. Madame Pomfrey's book,
Fur to Fangs, caring for magical half-humans, was moderately more helpful than some of the others Remus had read so far. There was still a lot he didn't understand. Advanced healing magic and complicated potions recipes, more details on legislation, and even more terrifying trials and persecution. Conversely, there was a lot he already knew. He'd been bitten and mustn't be allowed to bite anyone else during a full moon. Silver hurt him. There was no cure. The book did indeed say that with the onset of puberty his transformations would increase in intensity and that he would become more dangerous afterward. It did not mention changes in abilities, magical or otherwise, and there was nothing solid referring to changes in mood or temper. He didn't consider it particularly interesting or important to know that he had a shorter snout than real wolves or that his tail tufted. He'd rather not think about having either. But he was curious to discover that he was only a threat to humans, particularly wizards. Apparently other animals were in no danger from him. He mused himself, thinking that Mrs. Norris was safe at least. It did not go unnoticed that Remus had withdrawn from the marauders since the attack on Snape. "Where have you been?" they'd asked every evening as they all dressed for bed. "Homework," he'd shrug, or sometimes detention, though he hadn't had another detention since the prank. The truth was, he was always as far away from other people as he could get. He desperately tried to stay out of their room until it was time to sleep, and even avoided the common room if he could help it. He felt that until he could control his magic, he'd better not get involved in any more of James and Sirius's schemes. And they were scheming. He knew that for sure. Sometimes at night Remus could hear them sneaking into each other's beds, then whispering furtively before casting a silencing charm. Other times they crept out with Peter under the cloak. They always tried to wake Remus, but he ignored them. During the day he hid away at the back of the library or else in one of his secret places. He'd found places all over the castle that were small enough to climb inside and go undiscovered for hours at a time. Windows that had been long bricked over but retained high, broad ledges. Small empty chambers like priest holes concealed behind tapestries. The fifth-floor girls' bathroom. There he could curl up and read for hours. Sometimes he actually did his homework. Other times he forced himself to research his condition. He had another reason to hide. Since the incident, Snape's hatred toward the marauders had intensified, and he went everywhere with Mulciber, using him as personal protection. If they crossed paths in the hallway, Remus always had to be ready with a shielding charm. Mulciber knew more hexes than Sirius and James combined. One afternoon, Remus was deep into a book on ancient battle magic. There was a chapter in it on the Ulfnar, Germanic wolf warriors who fought the Romans. He was sitting high up on his favorite window ledge and couldn't be seen from the floor unless someone was really looking. He climbed up using a rope charm they'd learned a few weeks ago. He was just about to climb down and go for dinner when he made a wrong move and knocked the heavy book off the ledge. He winced as it plummeted to the hard stone floor with a deafening thud. "Who's there?" a voice came further up the corridor. He heard footsteps, and with a sinking feeling Remus realized he knew who it was. "Just a book," Mulciber said, sounding sullen. "Yes, but where did it come from?" Snape replied, suspicious. Mulciber huffed. "The library?" Snape muttered under his breath, sounding exasperated. Remus pressed as hard as he could against the stone wall. "Who's up there?" Snape called in his nasal, spiteful voice. Silence. Hominum revelio. Remus felt an odd tugging sensation in his stomach, and before he knew it was being pulled from the ledge by an unseen force. He yelped, scrambling for something to hold on to, and ended up dangling by the edge of his fingertips. Snape and Mulciber were laughing now. "Well, well," Snape purred. "If it isn't Loony Lupin. Where are all your little friends, eh? Put you up here and forgotten about you?" "Piss off, Snape," Remus hissed, losing purchase on the stone, hoping we wouldn't break his ankles when he dropped. "Ignis scopum," Snape smirked, pointing his wand. A thin rope of fire shot toward Remus, forcing him to kick off from the wall, landing on his back on the floor. Hard. He blinked, winded, but quickly climbed to his feet, drawing his own wand. "Okay," he said, his back sore from the fall. "You got me. Now go away."
Why on earth would we do that? Severus replied, raising his wand. Expelliarmus! Snape roared, beating him to it. He clutched Remus's wand gleefully, then added, Gelesco. Remus felt his feet fuse to the ground, sticking him in place. He groaned. He was stuck now. It might be worth calling for help, but the corridor was a quiet one, and he didn't want to look like a coward. He stared at them both defiantly, setting his jaw. Mulciber grinned, licking his lips. He raised his own wand, not quite as elegantly as Severus, but with the same malicious intent. Lepidosus! Nothing happened for a moment, and Remus felt a surge of relief, before suddenly, out of nowhere, a cloud of tiny stones, like gravel, appeared floating in mid-air. It hovered between Remus and Mulciber for a few moments, before beginning to fly at Remus's face, like a swarm of angry bees. He immediately raised his arms to protect himself, but Severus was too quick. Incarcerus, he said, yawning as if bored. Immediately Remus found himself bound tightly by rope, now hardly able to move at all. The stones kept pelting themselves at him, and all he could do was shut his eyes. He struggled, knowing it wouldn't help, but needing to do something. He didn't want to cry, even when he felt a hot trickle of blood slide down his temple.
What's going on? Severus? A girl's voice came from the end of the hall.
Finite incentatum, Snape whispered hurriedly. The stones dropped at once, the rope vanished, and Remus's legs became unstuck. He wobbled and staggered backward, leaning against the wall. He looked up in time to see Lily, his saviour, hurrying toward them. She stopped when she saw Remus, who was trying to wipe the blood from his face. She looked at Snape and frowned.
What are you doing, Sev?
Nothing. He looked at the ground, scuffing the toe of his shoe on the flagstones. Just chatting to Lupin, weren't we, Mulciber? Mulciber shrugged unconvincingly. Lily looked at Remus, who looked away, embarrassed. Bad enough to be caught by Severus. He didn't need her feeling sorry for him too. He snatched his wand from Severus quickly, turned, and started walking away as fast as he could.
Wait, Remus!
Lily ran after him. He didn't stop for her, but she was quick on her feet and caught up with him. She was clutching his battle magic book in one arm and grabbed hold of him with the other.
Please?
She huffed. He stopped, sighing heavily. He wanted his book back. What? He scowled.
What were they doing to you? Sev won't tell me, and I know it was bad.
It's fine, Remus shrugged, taking his book.
You're bleeding.
Leave off, Evans. Remus pushed her away, trying to leave again. She kept hurrying alongside him.
I told him to stop picking on you. I don't know why he does it. I mean, you don't even go round with Potter and Black anymore. I told him that...
Why would it matter?
You're the ones he really wants to annoy. If he knows that you've got sick of them too, then...
Wait. Remus stopped still. Lily nearly collided into him. Are you saying you'd be okay with it if Mulciber and Snape were cursing James and Sirius instead of me?
Well...
Lily flushed.
I mean, it would be a fair fight at least. And, you know, they do bring it on themselves, acting the way they do.
Remus felt even more uncomfortable now. She thought that James and Sirius had attacked Severus both times. She had no idea it was him at all. This confirmed one of his worst fears. Lily thought that Remus only hung around James and Sirius because he was odd and because they let him. Did everyone else in the castle think he was as pathetic as Peter? You're wrong, Remus frowned. Now leave me alone, will you?
Chapter 16.
Great to have you back, Lupin, Sirius grinned, pulling back the invisibility cloak as they entered the previously locked Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom. What do you mean? Remus replied, watching James climb the ladder in the corner of the room to reach the highest shelf where stood a cage of sleeping pixies. I haven't been anywhere.
Come on, mate, Peter said, holding the ladder for James. It hasn't escaped our notice you've been avoiding us like the plague.
I haven't, Remus twisted his mouth. Just been busy, studying and stuff.
Well, I hope you're over that phase now, James laughed, slowly climbing down, clutching the huge cage in both hands. I'd really appreciate it if you stopped working so hard. It makes me have to work hard, you see, and I'm not used to the competition."
"Oh, do one, Potter," Sirius snarled, rummaging through drawers and inside desks. Remus had decided that this prank wouldn't be too bad. It didn't require him to use any magic anyway. If he was completely honest with himself, he'd really missed all of their mischief. Being a swot was all well and good, but it wasn't half boring. No wonder Evans was always frowning. "How are we going to get them in the dining hall?" he asked, bending down to gaze at the tiny blue creatures, still sleeping, curled up at the bottom of the cage. There must have been about 50 of them, which Remus felt was rather cruel. Much better to liberate them. "Under the cloak," James replied, spreading it wide now so that they could all get under. "Come on, Sirius." He rolled his eyes at the long-haired boy who was now on his hands and knees under the teacher's desk. "What are you even looking for?" Peter asked, muffled under the cloak. "One of the Ravenclaws told me there was a trap door under here," Sirius sighed, getting up and dusting off his knees. "Liar." "This is Black's newest obsession," James explained to Remus as he closed the cloak over them and they headed for the door. "Finding secret doors." "Hogwarts history says there are loads of undiscovered passages," Sirius said defensively. "Like the one you found, Lupin, there's definitely more. I want to find at least one before we leave." "There's also supposed to be a monster hidden somewhere in the castle," James whispered back as they made their way along the halls toward Gryffindor Tower. Peter shuddered. "A risk I'm willing to accept," Sirius replied, and Remus could hear the grin in his voice. "My legacy is much more important." "Typical," James laughed. The next evening at dinner, James was grinning like a maniac, trying to look like he wasn't hiding 50 sleeping pixies beneath the table and failing miserably. Peter, who was good at astronomy, was busy checking over the other Marauders' homework, which was to label every star on their chart. "Honestly," Peter groaned, scribbling something out on Sirius's. "You'd think you'd get your own bloody star, right?" Sirius laughed. "What can I say? I'm hopeless." "You have your own star?" Remus frowned, once again finding himself on the back foot. He never paid any attention in astronomy. He knew the phases of the moon, and that was plenty. "Sirius," Peter replied. "Come on, Lupin, we've done this. It's the brightest star in the sky. The dog star." He sighed, looking at Remus's work now. "Yep, you've missed it too," he groaned. Remus shrugged. "I just thought it was his name." "The noble and most ancient House of Black has always been a bit artsy with its naming conventions," Sirius mused. "Half of us have astronomical names. There's Bellatrix, of course. My dad's Orion. My brother's Regulus. Mum isn't a star. I think she's an asteroid. Pretty apt if you've ever seen her in a bad mood. Then there's good old Uncle Alphard, Uncle Cygnus. Andromeda's named after a whole galaxy." "Wizards are so weird," Remus sighed. "Remus," James sniggered, "you do know that Lupus is a constellation too, don't you? The wolf?" "The what?" Remus felt his heart skip a beat and he nearly choked on his dinner. Sirius slapped him hard on his back, deftly changing the subject. "If you're nearly finished telling us how stupid we all are, Pete, can we get on with releasing the you-know-whats? My lovely cousins have just started eating." "I'd call that perfect timing." It really was perfect. James gave the cage a sharp kick to wake up the pixies before sweeping away the cloak and whispering a quick unlocking charm on the cage. There was an explosion of noise and colour and chaos. Remus hadn't really known what to expect from the pixies. They'd seemed perfectly harmless all night and day while they'd been locked up sleeping under James's bed. But now he could see exactly why Sirius and James had been so excited. As they burst out from under the table, the tiny creatures scattered in all directions, chattering in high-pitched gibberish and zooming back and forth across the great hall. They leapt into plates of mashed potato, squealing with delight. They grabbed plates and cutlery out of students' hands and flung them across the room. They pulled ponytails and tore at parchment. "Quick!" James ducked under the table where they all crouched under the invisibility cloak, watching the anarchy unravel around them. "Brilliant," Sirius kept saying. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Come on, Remus said, nudging the other boys forward. Their plan had been to observe for a while, then sneak out of the hall as quickly as possible without getting caught. All four of them awkwardly navigated their way out from under the table, which was made especially difficult by several other students attempting to dive for cover. Fortunately, pixies couldn't see through invisibility cloaks, and they were left alone. In the uproar, no one else noticed them either. Girls were screaming, boys were shouting. Everyone was trying to cover their heads to protect themselves from dive-bombing pixies, or else struggling to grab back their stolen items. "Oh, yes!" Sirius suddenly gasped, bursting into fitful laughter. Remus turned and saw Bellatrix, screaming at the top of her lungs, her wild hair being yanked from side to side by the tiny blue pests. Another, fluting above her, had caught her wand and was waving it at her, zapping blue lightning. "Get off me, you disgusting, you—" she wailed. Narcissa was cowering under the table, clutching her wand tightly. Things escalated even further as Peeves the poltergeist entered the room, zipping about gleefully and causing just as much havoc. He seemed to be directing the pixies, lifting tablecloths and screeching, "Under here, piskies! Lots of iggle firsties down here!" Stifling laughter, the marauders fled from the room when they heard Professor McGonagall's voice ring out, "Petrificus totalis!" "She's definitely going to know it was us," Peter wheezed as they made their way back to the tower, still under the cloak. "Nah," James replied casually. "I bet she blames it on the Pruitts. They always do big stuff like that. Something to aspire to." "Please," Sirius said. "No," replied Remus. "Please." "No. Why not?" "It would just feel weird. I don't want you to." "But it'll be fun. I promise you'll enjoy it." Ha. This conversation had carried on much in the same way for about 3 corridors now. Remus ended up trying to hurry ahead, and heard James chastise Sirius behind him. "Leave Lupin alone, will you?" "I will not. This is too important." Sirius was in a restless mood, which tended to make him extra obnoxious. Usually James was the only one who could put up with him. They had a long afternoon in the library completing zodiac charts for their astronomy revision. Exams were still months away, but James insisted on having a head start. Of course, Sirius had to compete, and Peter had to go anywhere James went. Remus didn't want to be left out. They'd been musing over their star signs when it had come up that Remus was a Pisces. Sirius had quickly deduced that this meant his birthday was coming up, and so the pleading had begun. "It's obviously something that's not that important to Remus," James hissed to Sirius. "Do something for my birthday if you have to. It's not long after." "You'll get your turn," Sirius dismissed him. "But first, Lupin." "I don't really care, Sirius," Remus sighed as they reached the portrait of the fat lady. "Don't make a fuss." "But it's your birthday," Sirius replied earnestly. "We should make a fuss." Remus didn't see why. No one had ever made a fuss before. There was cake, of course, but sharing a cake with 50 other boys didn't leave much. Plus, all the little kids insisted on getting a turn to blow out the candles too, so it took forever. Matron wrapped up a few gifts, but they were usually practical. New clothes, socks, underwear, pens and notebooks. Other than that, there was nothing special about the day at all. He was actually looking forward to being away from St. Edmunds because he thought that Sirius, James and Peter were probably too well bred to know about the birthday bumps. A pinch in the arm for each year of age, and one for luck, usually the hardest. "Why does it matter so much?" Remus huffed, climbing through the portrait hole. He couldn't stand it when Sirius was like this, stubborn and persistent. But when he turned round, he was surprised to see that Sirius was rubbing his arm, looking uncharacteristically hurt. "You did all that stuff for my birthday, and it was really nice. I never much looked forward to it before, but, well, it was great, wasn't it?" Remus suddenly felt guilty. He realized that Sirius didn't just want to be the center of attention again. He was trying to make Remus happy, as if that might make him happy too. Remus had never had much opportunity to give somebody what they really wanted. He relented. Okay, fine. But not a big party or anything. Just marauders, all right? Right. Sirius grinned. At once his face was transformed, eyes twinkling like little stars. Chapter 17. First Year. 12. Remus's 12th birthday fell on a Friday that year. Usually on Fridays after lessons, James would force them all to go and watch the Gryffindor Quidditch practice, and Remus could read quietly to himself. Sirius, however, had managed to convince James that he could miss just one practice, especially as he wasn't even on the team yet, and that Remus might actually want to do something different on his birthday. He was woken early in the morning by his 3 dorm mates piling onto his bed, all shouting, "Happy birthday, Lupin!" They didn't try to punch him, which meant that the day was already off to a head start as his best birthday ever. At breakfast, James and Sirius marched ahead, pushing other students out of the way as they approached their usual seats, loudly announcing, "Out of the way, please! Birthday boy coming through! Move along! Nothing to see here!" Remus wanted to hide under the table by the time they'd reached it. His 3 friends made a huge show of serving him his breakfast rather than letting him get anything for himself. Peter poured his tea, James loaded up his plate, while Sirius buttered his toast. "Do you have to?" Remus groaned, horribly embarrassed. "Absolutely," James said. "Definitely," Peter nodded. "Unquestionably," finished Sirius. Remus shook his head, blushing hard and looking down at his food. When he'd finished, which took a while, as he'd been given double portions of almost everything, they stood up, still grinning widely at him. "What?" he asked, twitching nervously. If they were going to do the birthday bumps, then he hoped it would be over with quickly. Perhaps there was a wizard version? He'd missed Sirius's birthday after all. He didn't know what to expect. Peter and James each put a hand on his shoulder, forcing him to sit down again. Sirius pulled a pitch pipe from his robe's pocket and blew a long note. Remus squeezed his eyes shut. Oh no. "Happy birthday to you," the 3 boys bellowed at the top of their voices. "Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Remus." Now the rest of the hall had joined in, and Remus covered his head with his hands. "Happy birthday to you." "Hip hip!" James yelled, standing on his chair. "Hooray!" the Gryffindors chorused back. "At least that's over and done with," Remus muttered, his face burning as they finished cheering. Peter looked at him with pity. "Sorry, mate, but they're planning to do it again at lunch and dinner." They still had to sit through potions as their last lesson of the week. Remus had found that even when he did all of his homework and understood all of the texts, he still had no natural talent for potion making. On top of that, it was a boring subject, and Slughorn began to bang on about the 5 key components of sleeping draughts. Remus began to doze off himself. Snape didn't bother him. Actually, Snape hadn't so much as glanced in Remus's direction since the incident in the corridor. Lily flashed him a smile and wished him happy birthday before rolling her huge emerald eyes as James and Sirius attempted to convince Slughorn not to give them any homework out of respect for the occasion. At dinner, Remus endured what he hoped was his final round of happy birthday, which had been the loudest yet, largely because Dumbledore was present and began conducting the entire school, bellowing at the top of his own voice. He also received a few cards, one from the whole of Gryffindor House, another from Matron, along with a new pair of socks. After dinner, they sat in the common room and Sirius lugged down his heavy record player and put on Electric Warrior for the 100th time since Christmas. At some point, a cake was produced with red and gold Gryffindor icing and 12 pink candles. When Remus cut it open, all the while encouraged to make a wish, not able to think about a single thing he wanted, he was amazed to find that it was made up of 4 different flavors: a quarter chocolate, a quarter lemon drizzle, a quarter Victoria sponge, and a quarter coffee and walnut. "Like your toast?" Sirius grinned, looking thrilled at the expression of surprise on Remus's face. Thought you'd get bored if it was all one flavour.
Wow, thanks. So what do you want to do for the rest of the evening? James asked. It still looks light enough if you did want to go and watch the...
He doesn't, James. Bloody hell, you're going to have to start developing some other interests, mate. You're getting boring. I don't mind if you want to go and watch the Quidditch practice, Remus said hurriedly. You've already done plenty, honestly. 3 songs in one day. What more could one 12-year-old ask for?
No, James shook his head heroically. Sirius is right, it's your birthday. We'll do something you like doing. They were all quiet for a little while, before James cleared his throat. Lupin, what do you like doing? Remus thought. He could very easily give a list of things he did not enjoy doing. Football, homework, flying, potions. But no one had ever asked him before what sort of things he did enjoy. He liked watching telly, but so far he hadn't discovered a TV at Hogwarts. He liked being able to choose what he ate for breakfast and dinner. He liked listening to Mark Bolan singing through Sirius's record player. None of these things were really hobbies. Reading? Peter said, trying to be helpful. You read a lot.
Do I?
Remus raised his eyebrows. He hadn't thought about it, but it was true. Since Christmas, anyway, he'd finished all his set texts for the year and even a few books checked out from the library. Oh, yeah, great! James rolled his eyes. Happy birthday, Lupin. Let's start a book club. Sirius sniggered. Peter looked annoyed. Well, I don't know. Other than reading, you seem to like detention, Remus. Remus laughed at that, holding up his hands apologetically.
Sorry, lads, I reckon I must just be really boring. What about when you disappear off?
Sirius asked suddenly. Remus balked.
What do you mean? I told you I've been sick. I go to the hospital wing.
He hurried. Sirius waved a hand.
No, not then. Sometimes you go off after lessons or while we're watching Quidditch. What are you doing?
Remus felt himself go red. He'd been wandering off by himself less and less, but clearly his friends had still noticed. They all looked at him expectantly. He bit his lip.
I just sort of walk around, he said lamely.
Where, though? Peter asked. In the grounds?
Everywhere, Remus shrugged. I just like to look about, so I know where stuff is.
He pulled the map out of his back pocket.
It's stupid. I started adding stuff to the map they gave us at the beginning of the year, and whenever I see something interesting, I've put it in.
James took the map and unfolded it. The 3 boys peered over to see. They were quiet for a while. Sirius looked in awe.
You've added all the portraits, and labelled them and everything. My spelling's rubbish.
Remus blushed harder, wanting to snatch it back. James's face was scrunched up. What's that? He pointed at a mark Remus had made on one of the staircases.
One of the trick steps, Remus replied. That's one of the steps you can sink into. That one,
he pointed to a mark on a different step,
is one that vanishes. The staircases with arrows are the ones that move. I color-coded so you can see where they end up.
Merlin, Peter exhaled. Do you have any idea how much time this would save me? I swear I get trapped on the wrong corridor twice a week because of those flipping stairs.
And me, James said. Sod getting to lessons on time, Sirius burst out. Please try to recognize the extremely important implications of this map. The possibilities now available to us for practical jokes.
A smile spread across James's face, then Peter's. Remus snatched the map back, folding it up.
I'm not finished yet. There's loads to do. I wanted to do some spells on it once I figure it out. What sort of spells?
Sirius asked eagerly. Remus hesitated. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate Sirius's interest or his excitement, but Remus had really wanted to work the map out for himself, as silly as it had sounded. After all, Sirius had come up with the reading spell and the rain cloud incantation. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Remus just had a strong desire to prove that he was just as clever, or just as able, to put in the legwork this time.
Just some improvements, he said cautiously. You'll think it's silly.
No, we won't, Peter replied earnestly. We can help.
I suppose. It's my map, though. Of course it's yours, James smiled soothingly. Like the cloak is mine, right? But in the service of mischief... It's the Marauders, Sirius finished, his eyes twinkling. The Marauders map, Remus repeated, still not 100% comfortable with handing over his private project. It's still yours, Lupin, Black continued. We'll put your name first and everything. Not sure if we want our names on it, Peter said nervously. All right, nicknames then. We don't have nicknames, Remus replied. Well, I suppose I sort of do, but I really don't want Looney Lupin written on it. The other three burst out laughing. After that, Remus decided it wasn't so bad letting them in on his secret. He was actually relieved. He'd been starting to wonder if it wasn't just some private insanity of his, tracking and logging everything in the castle, getting it down, making sense of it. James, Sirius, and Peter seemed less interested in the satisfaction of the task and more keen on planning the next prank with it. The rest of the evening was spent under the cloak roaming the halls. The cloak, in Remus's opinion, was not strictly necessary, as they were all planning to be back before curfew, but James and Sirius never missed an opportunity to turn even the smallest trip into a full-scale mission, and Peter just enjoyed sneaking around unseen. All became clear, however, when Sirius produced 5 dung bombs with which they entertained themselves en route, creeping up behind unsuspecting snogging couples or dropping them in the pockets of older students hurrying to the library. Remus showed them what he'd worked out so far, the passages and shortcuts he'd discovered, and even a few of his hidden places. Not all of them, of course, just in case. He even told him his plan to put some kind of tracking spell on Mrs. Norris so that he'd be able to see her coming. They loved that idea. Why stop there? Sirius whispered as they turned a corner back to the common room at the end of the night. Why not track everyone? Everyone? Yeah, then we know when anyone was coming. We could get away with anything. I don't know, Remus replied, uncomfortable with the idea. What would happen when his friends saw him travelling down to the Whomping Willow every month? How long before they decided to follow him and got themselves killed? For the first time, Remus realized that the map was not as harmless as he'd first thought. But James and Peter were busy agreeing with Sirius, saying it was an excellent idea, already imagining being able to see what Dumbledore was up to or where Snape was lurking. Remus firmly believed that given enough time, Sirius Black and James Potter truly could do anything they wanted. It was just who they were. He just hoped that it would be a long time yet. Chapter 18. First Year. Revision. Time seemed to speed up after Remus's birthday. The days lengthened and spring rushed into the castle, flooding it with sunlight and fresh air after the long winter. Exams loomed, and Remus finally got over his anxiety round reading in public, spending more and more time in the library. Instead of planning new schemes and pranks, the Marauders found their evenings devoted to practicing spells and quizzing each other on potions ingredients. Sirius and James took the exams very seriously. It was a competition to them. Though they would both have denied it vehemently, Remus suspected that they both had a desire to defend their pure-blood honour. It was too ingrained as an attitude throughout the school, even amongst the teachers. It didn't bother Remus. Even if he wasn't getting top marks and everything, he was still doing better than he ever had before. He was actually glad he had no family to pressure him. The pressure on Peter was all too evident. He wasn't a bad student by any means. In herbology and astronomy he even flourished, often beating James. But he was nervous, and it tended to affect his wand work, making his incantations sloppy. Peter didn't talk about his family very much, but he received a lot of letters from them, and Remus noticed that James was careful round the subject. "How much do we need to pass this year?" the round-faced boy would ask desperately at least 4 times a day. "Peter, calm down," James would soothe. "You're going to be fine. You know all the theory backwards now. It's just putting it into practice." "I don't blame him for being a bit twitchy," Sirius whispered to Remus when the other two were out of earshot. "They've been at least 12 squibs in the Pettigrew family, and that's just this century." "Squibs? Non-magical wizards," Sirius explained patiently. "You know how Muggle families sometimes have magical kids? It works the other way, too. No one likes to talk about it much. My great-great-uncle actually had this mad theory that Muggles were swapping their children with ours so that they could infiltrate the wizarding world. Completely bonkers, obviously.
Right, Remus replied, hoping he sounded as if he understood everything Sirius had just said.
So that's why Peter's magic is a bit wonky? I don't know.
Sirius shrugged.
Maybe. I don't know if they can actually prove that squibbishness runs in families, but it's the reason the Pettigrews aren't in the Sacred 28.
Remus sighed heavily, fixing Sirius with his most withering look.
You know I don't know what that is.
Sirius smirked.
Well, I don't know, Lupin. With all that reading you do these days, nice to know there's some things I've got over you.
Remus snorted in reply, looking back at his work. Sirius carried on quickly, as if reluctant to lose the other boy's attention.
The Sacred 28 are the purest of the purebloods, the last remaining untainted families.
Remus gave Sirius another mean look. The dark-haired boy held up his hands, hurrying to explain.
Their words, not mine. No, I don't believe any of that purity blood rubbish. Right.
Remus raised an eyebrow.
Bet the blacks are top of the list, though. Actually,
Sirius replied, eyes glittering with humour,
the abbots are first. It's alphabetical.
Remus groaned and went back to his potions revision. Exams were not at the top of Remus's list to worry about. He was relatively sure he'd do okay. He'd even checked the examination rules, which were 5 yards of parchment in length, and confirmed that the use of the Scribble Clara charm for tidying up handwriting was acceptable, as long as the student was able to perform the spell by themselves. Remus had been using the spell since November and had no concerns. 2 things were worrying Remus far more than passing the year. First, there was the grim knowledge that he would have to return to St. Edmund's in June. Though he had only been away for a few months, the difference between St. Edmund's and Hogwarts seemed as vast as the difference between monochrome and technicolor. While other students cheerfully looked forward to a long hot summer full of holidays abroad, relaxation and lions, Remus felt as though he were facing exile. They weren't permitted to perform any magic outside of Hogwarts until they were 17, which meant that, as well as losing contact with his friends, Remus would no longer be able to read. To him, summer stretched ahead, blank and desolate, punctuated by long, angry nights locked away in his cell. And there was Remus's second problem, ready as always to rear its ugly, hairy snout. As Madame Pomfrey had predicted, since Remus had turned 12, his transformations had become much, much worse. There was no explanation for this in any of the books he read, other than some vague words about adolescence and puberty. Whereas before he might have come away with a few teeth and claw marks, the kind you'd get from a playful puppy who meant no real harm, he now awoke with deep, furious gashes which bled copiously until Pomfrey arrived to staunch them. The agony of the transformation itself had reached almost intolerable levels, and he often felt queasy for hours before the moon rose. To make matters worse, Remus was spending longer and longer stretches in the hospital wing, and it was getting harder and harder to explain why. His friends had started wondering aloud what on earth could be ailing him, sometimes suggesting he was putting it on to get out of lessons, other times teasing him about him being contagious. At least back at St. Edmund's he didn't have any friends who cared where he went every month. Sirius clearly wasn't looking forward to the summer either. He grew uncharacteristically quiet whenever the upcoming holiday was mentioned, his eyes clouding over, the colour leaving his face. James invited all of them for a stay at his for as long as they wanted, but Sirius remained pessimistic.
You know they'll never let me, he sighed.
Cheer up, mate. James slung an arm round his friend. They sat together on the big couch in the common room, Peter in an armchair, concentrating on turning a banana into a slipper. It wasn't working. Remus was lying on the rug in front of the fireplace on his belly. He had a cut on his back that wasn't knitting together properly, even after Madame Pomfrey's ministrations, and had found that this was the only position which wasn't uncomfortable. Sirius plainly didn't want to cheer up.
They won't, though. Bellatrix's bloody wedding is in June. You can bet I'll have to be around for all of it.
We got an invite to that, Peter suddenly spoke, looking up from his slipper, which was still bright yellow and looked unpleasantly squishy. Probably see you there.
Yeah, great,
Sirius huffed, exhaling so hard that his long hair puffed up over his forehead.
If I haven't been turned into a newt, or cursed into a portrait for the summer. They actually did that to Andromeda once. She's never been the same. Hates wizard paintings now.
After the wedding, James said, tactfully trying to steer the conversation away from the Black family, then we'll have to work something out. I'll break you out of there if I have to, I swear. Sirius grinned at James, and James grinned back. Their body language mirrored each other perfectly, and Remus felt a pang of loneliness. He knew there was much more to Sirius's family problems than just him being the black sheep. There were the scars Sirius had shown him back in September, obviously, but as far as Remus knew, those were perfectly normal. Matron beat him if he acted up, and he'd often got the cane from his Muggle teachers. There was no reason for him to suspect that Sirius's home life was out of the ordinary. James obviously knew a lot more about it. Remus could tell because it was the one thing Potter never teased Sirius about: family. They talked a lot at night, the pair of them. Remus had heard Sirius crying more than once. It made him want to cast his own silencing spell. He hated the sound of tears, and rarely cried himself. "You too, Lupin," James was saying. Remus lifted his head from his thoughts. He arched his back carefully and tried not to grimace when the pain split his back like a bolt of lightning. "You should come and stay over the summer. We've got loads of room, and Mum doesn't mind."
"Can't."
Remus shook his head, looking back down at his book. His back was on fire.
"Matron won't let me. Legal guardian stuff. Muggle law."
"There'll be a way around it," James replied confidently. "Both of you are coming, right? I'm making it happen." Remus smiled, but he knew there was nothing James could do. The full moons were due at the end of each month, as they always were, and there wasn't enough of a window even for a week at the end of the summer. Besides, Matron really wouldn't let him. "I think I've done it!" Peter gasped suddenly, holding his bright yellow slipper aloft.
"Well done, Pete," Sirius said dully. "Try it on, see if it fits."
Remus sat up, his back now very painful indeed. As he straightened, he felt a warm slither of blood run down his spine and soak into the waistband of his trousers. Alarmed, he stood up quickly. "Ugh!" Peter yelped, withdrawing his bare foot from the slipper, covered in sticky banana slime. James burst out laughing, his glasses falling askew. "He was joking, Pete. You've got to stop doing stuff just because we tell you to."
"You okay, Lupin?"
Sirius looked up suddenly. Remus was dithering on the rug. He had to get to the hospital wing right away, but he had no idea how to explain himself.
"Yeah, just think I'll go for a walk." "Where? It's almost curfew."
Sirius's face lit up.
"What are you planning?" No, nothing. I just fancied—"
"We'll come." James stood up too. "I'll get the cloak."
"No!"
Remus shouted. They all froze, even Peter, who was halfway through picking banana strings from between his toes.
Remus stammered. I don't feel well. I just want to go to Madame Pomfrey, that's all."
"All right, mate." James held up his hands gently. "Calm down. Want us to come with you anyway?"
"I'll go,"
Sirius said quickly. She stood up and took Remus by the elbow, steering him toward the portrait hole before the other two could say anything.
"Sirius,"
Remus started once they were out into the empty corridor.
"It's all right, Lupin. I'm just walking you there. Won't go in with you or anything."
Remus looked at him confused, then nodded and started walking as quickly as his sore back would let him. He knew Sirius well enough now to know there was no changing his mind. Peter might have let his nerves get the better of him and run back. James might have respected his wishes. But Sirius always had to push it.
"Are you all right?"
Sirius asked, eyeing him.
"You're walking stiffly." I don't feel well,"
Remus repeated through gritted teeth. He hoped Sirius would just think he was angry with him and not realize he was actually biting back a growl of pain.
"Oh, okay,"
Sirius replied smoothly. They continued walking in silence. When they finally reached the hospital wing, they stood outside awkwardly for a few moments, Remus's hot amber eyes staring into Sirius's cool blue stare as if daring him to ask a question.
"Hope you feel better," was all Sirius said. "Can we come and visit you tomorrow if you're not out?"
"Suppose so," Remus said warily. He tried to shrug, then winced. Sirius's expression did not flicker.
"Look after yourself, Lupin,"
he said quietly before turning and hurrying back the way they'd come. Remus watched him go until he turned the corner. He'd had the strangest feeling that Sirius would glance back at him before disappearing. When he didn't, Remus couldn't help but feel strangely disappointed, though he ought to have known better. Sirius Black was never predictable. He shivered slightly, partly because of the mounting pain, and partly because of something else, then pushed open the hospital door. There's a note here, so I'm going to put it out there. It's like a trigger warning. There is a homophobic slur toward the end of this chapter. Chapter 19, First Year, End of Term. Remus would never tell anyone, but he really enjoyed the Hogwarts exam period. There were no lessons for a whole 2 weeks, and while everyone else ran round like a headless chicken, Remus felt very relaxed about the whole thing. The same could not be said for the rest of his classmates. Lily Evans had taken to ambushing other students in the library and common rooms, demanding that they quiz her on 18th century goblin riots. Peter seemed to constantly be muttering to himself under his breath, wringing his hands together. Marlene McKinnon and Mary MacDonald, 2 Gryffindor first years Remus tried to avoid, kept bursting into fits of hysterical giggles from the nerves. James and Sirius appeared to be acting out with more bravado than ever, sending flameless firecrackers in the corridors and performing vanishing spells on unsuspecting students' book bags in the library. Remus couldn't tell if the two of them were just responding to the general atmosphere of anxiety, or whether they were expelling their own nervous energy. The older students had no sympathy for their younger counterparts. Frank Longbottom gave out more detentions during the last week of term than he had all year, and even threatened to take 50 points from Gryffindor if James and Sirius didn't stop levitating inkwells in the common room. Remus felt they got off easy. Bellatrix Black actually cursed half of the Slytherins one evening for talking too loudly while she studied for her NEWTs. They couldn't speak for 3 days. Madame Pomfrey had to grow their tongues back. Their first exam was Charms, which Remus had off to a good start. All they had to do was bewitch a coconut to dance an Irish jig, which he privately thought was very easy. He, James and Sirius managed without a problem, though Peter's coconut at first refused to move at all, then lost control once it finally got going, and ended up spinning off the desk, smashing all over the flagstones. Transfiguration went almost as well, though it was a trickier subject. The task was to turn a stag beetle into a pepper shaker. Sirius completed this in minutes, barely concealing his pride as McGonagall commented that it was the best example of small-scale transfiguration she'd ever seen from a first year. Remus's shaker wasn't too bad, though it was still shiny and black, whereas Sirius had somehow managed to make his glass. James attempted porcelain and seemed to have done well until McGonagall tried to shake some pepper out of it, and it spread its wings and flew out the window, causing Marlene and Mary to shriek. Peter's pepper pot still had legs and antlers even after an hour. Herbology and History of Magic were both written exams. Remus surprised himself by writing the longest history essay in the class. He had to ask Peter, sitting next to him, for extra parchment. Apparently there was plenty to be said about the goblin riots after all. Potions was easier than he expected. They had to brew a cure for warts from memory. Having a very good memory from years of practice, Remus knew he had all the ingredients and quantities right, even if his preparation skills were lacking precision. Between exams, Remus enjoyed his last week of freedom, either wandering the halls and adding to his map, when he was alone, or eating ice cream outside by the lake, when the others were with him. He'd recently found a corridor that smelled vaguely of chocolate, but couldn't work out what that meant. It was nowhere near the kitchens. The days were much warmer now, and as June opened up and the testing came to a close, the Marauders' minds turned to mischief. "It's got to be big," James said decisively. He was always making unnecessary statements like that, waiting for someone else to come up with an idea for him to approve. "Our last hurrah!" "Not our last," Sirius replied, picking at the grass. "We'll be back in 2 months. "You lot might be," Peter worried. "I know I've failed everything." James waved a hand, dismissing Peter's fears. It was too warm and lazy of a day to spend long reassuring him. They were lounging in their new favourite spot, near a tree by the lake. Peter was sitting under the shade cast by the branches because he was fair and burnt easily. James and Sirius had stripped off their robes and rolled up the sleeves of their brilliant white uniform shirts to combat the heat. Remus simply lay in the sunshine, robes still on to cover up his freshest injuries, enjoying the warmth sinking into his aching joints. He liked the spot because the Whomping Willow was behind them, so they didn't have to look at it.
"Have we got any dung bombs left?" Remus asked, squinting up at the blue sky, then closing his eyes to look at the patterns burned into his retinas.
"Yeah, a few. Not enough for a big send-off, though."
"How big were you thinking exactly?"
"Bigger than dung bombs," James replied, cleaning his glasses, as he often did when he was thinking. "Big enough so that everyone knows it was us."
"They'll know it was us. McGonagall always knows,"
Sirius put in, standing up and skimming a stone across the lake. It bounced 5 times. Sirius was amazing at skimming stones. He had this sort of fluid grace that was more animal than man. It drove Remus mad. After all, he was the one that wasn't strictly human, and he had all the natural grace of a flobberworm. "They might think it's the Pruitts," James shot back. "They've been beating us all year."
"Nothing beat the Pixies,"
Sirius said defensively. He threw another stone. This time, on its 4th bounce, a long silvery tentacle rose from the water and batted it back toward him. Sirius grinned.
"And the itching powder was pretty good, you have to admit," Remus murmured, flinging an arm over his face. "Exactly," Sirius continued enthusiastically. "You've got to give us points for ingenuity there."
"And the rain cloud," Peter piped up, eager to be involved. They all fell quiet. Remus sat up. They hadn't talked about that incident at all since January. Peter gnawed his lip, realizing what he'd done. Sirius shook his head, changing the subject.
"Anyway, the point is, the 4 of us have got more detentions than the rest of Gryffindor combined this year. What do you want us to do, James? Sign our work?"
He pulled back his arm to throw the stone back into the lake, but James leapt up and grabbed his shoulder, causing him to drop it.
"Hey!"
Sirius frowned, annoyed.
"What are you playing at?"
"That's it!" James jumped excitedly.
"We sign our work!" "You what?"
Remus squinted at both of them. He wished he hadn't stared at the sun for so long. His eyes were fogged over and he was starting to get a headache.
"Sign our work!"
James repeated, as if he were making perfect sense and they were all too thick to get it. He sighed, impatient. "We put our mark on Hogwarts, literally."
"Are you talking about defacing school property, Potter?"
Sirius arched a dark eyebrow, joy written all over his face. "I just might be, Black." James wriggled his eyebrows in return. He couldn't just raise one, like Sirius could.
"Well, I say, old man,"
Sirius grinned, adopting an even more plummy, aristocratic accent than usual. "What do you say, old bean?"
"I say it's a simply riffing idea."
"Oh, spiffing. Good show."
"Rather."
They both dissolved into giggles, falling on the ground in wrestling. Remus and Peter shared a look. This was the sort of thing that was happening more and more. James and Sirius would get caught up in one of their own plays and leave the others behind. Remus stood and went over to sit with Peter.
"Any idea what they're on about?"
he asked the smaller boy. Peter was red in the face, his forehead creased. He was clearly thinking deeply. "They want us to write our names somewhere. On the walls?" he said slowly.
"What?" Remus asked. "Like, carve it into the stone or something? That's a bit permanent, isn't it?"
James and Sirius continued wrestling. James was larger and usually had the upper hand, but Sirius fought dirty. "It's all I can think of," Peter shrugged. "James says he wants it big. The walls are the biggest— Oh! He jumped up. "Lads," he squeaked, "I've had an idea."
"Blimey!"
James and Sirius stopped at once. James had Sirius in a headlock, and Sirius's ankle was just inching around James's, ready to yank and topple them both. "Are you feeling okay, Pettigrew?" "The lawn!" Pettigrew continued, pacing as he thought out loud. "It's the biggest canvas, and it wouldn't have to be permanent. It could be if we used a quick-grow potion." Remus sighed deeply. Why wasn't anyone making sense today? And so it was down to James's desire for notoriety and Peter's desperation to prove himself that all 4 of them found themselves back out onto the grounds after dark on the last day of term. They'd had 2 weeks to plan it, hoarding supplies from the greenhouse and learning various colour-changing incantations. In the meantime, they'd learnt that they'd passed all their exams, even Peter. Remus had come first in History of Magic and second in Charms, to Lily Evans, which he tried not to let bother him.
Ow, that was my foot! Sorry!
I can't see a thing. It's dark out, idiot.
Oh, that was my foot!
Can we take the cloak off now?
Yeah, I think so.
They had dragged a heavy sack of hydrangea seeds all the way down from the tower. Well, Remus and Peter had. James and Sirius decided that they would lead the way. Right, James said, businesslike, hands on his hips. Did we agree to write love or from?
From?
Peter said.
I prefer love,
Sirius said. Oh, of course you do, Black. James ruffled his hair playfully, causing Sirius to duck and pull a face. Love it is. Come on, gentlemen, to work. An hour later, the sack of seeds was empty, and Remus was following the trail the others had left, drizzling the Quick Grow potion over the ground. Are you sure we spelled everything right? James scratched his head, messing his hair up even more.
Too late now,
Sirius replied, wiping sweat from his brow.
Look, we better go. Sun's coming up.
He pointed to the sky, which was beginning to glow pink.
The colour-changing spell, quick!
I did it already, Remus said, finishing the last of the potion.
While they were still in the bag. Good thinking, Lupin.
Sirius slapped him on the shoulder.
Knew you were the logical one.
Since when? Remus thought to himself. Let's not go in yet, James said. Look, we can watch the sunrise.
Merlin,
Sirius laughed.
You big goof.
They did watch, though, in awe as the glowing orange sun slowly climbed over the horizon, flooding the great lake with golden sparks, then paling as it rose higher and higher into the parchment-coloured sky. Next year'll be even better, lads, James grinned, his glasses reflecting the new sun, as he threw an arm each round Peter and Sirius. Remus stood slightly off to the side, content to just stand with them. They headed back to the castle in a strange mood, and almost forgot to put the cloak back on. They returned to Gryffindor Tower, and James and Peter tried to sleep, but Remus couldn't. For one thing, Sirius had finally begun packing. He'd been putting it off for a week now, and now began throwing his things in carelessly and noisily into his mahogany trunk. It was embossed with a serpent, like so many of Sirius's things. For another thing, Remus didn't want to sleep. His last few hours at Hogwarts were draining away so quickly, and he didn't want to miss any of them. He sat on the windowsill and watched their prank developing in the grass below. The seeds were already taking root and growing very quickly, twisting and writhing below like something in a science fiction film.
Looking good,
Sirius said, coming over to look. He'd apparently finished packing, though his trunk didn't look like it would close properly.
Still think it should have been was, not were,
Remus said.
Bad grammar, Lupin.
Sirius yawned.
Couldn't have lived with myself.
He stretched sleepily and backed into Remus's bed, which happened to be nearest, curling up to sleep. Remus looked at him for a while from his window ledge. With his eyes closed, in the gentle dawn light, Sirius seemed softer, younger. Remus had spent the whole year in awe of him and James, how invincible they were, how daring. But they were all just kids together, really, and no matter how big their final prank was, it wouldn't stop the train coming from them tomorrow, to take Remus back to St. Edmund's, and Sirius back to wherever it was he lived, a house where the portraits shouted at him, and his family didn't care that he'd come top in Transfiguration. He looked out the window again, pressing his forehead to the cool glass and sighing deeply. It was a really good prank. They all ought to be proud. McGonagall would throw a fit. Dumbledore would probably like it. There was no need to feel so gloomy. It was only 2 months. 50 feet below, the hydrangeas finally bloomed, and Remus's heart skipped a beat. The gaudy flowers flashed below in Gryffindor colours, bright crimson and glimmering gold, blaring out their wonky lettered message. The Marauders were here. Chapter 20. Summer, 1972. Dear Remus, how's your summer so far? Mine is rubbish. Last week was Bellatrix's wedding. At least she won't be at Hogwarts next year. Regulus and I were groomsmen and had to wear green dress robes. Definitely not my colour. My whole family was there. It was awful. You should have seen what Bella did to her hair. She looked completely mental. Sissy has dyed hers too. Blonde, so she looks like a stuck-up boyfriend Malfoy. Can't believe my aunt let her. Bet my mum wouldn't let me dye my hair. I wish we could do magic out of school. I've been researching curses in Dad's library. Should have some excellent stuff for Snivelus next year. James says his parents are letting me stay with them this summer. My parents won't let me go to the Potters, but they might let me go stay with the Pettigrews, so I'm getting Pete to invite me. James said he'd invite you too. I hope you can come. It'll be great, just like school. See you soon. Sirius O. Black. Dear Remus, hoping you're having a good summer and the muggles aren't getting you down. Mum and Dad say you're more than welcome to come for a visit. Sirius is trying to wrangle the whole summer, which would be brilliant. If you can come, reply to this owl ASAP. Mum says she'll write a letter herself if your matron needs her to. Best, James. Dear Remus, James and Sirius says they've tried to get in touch with you, but you haven't replied. I told them maybe you didn't know how owls worked. You just tie the letter to their foot like we've done, then let it go. They usually end up where they're supposed to. Hope you can come and visit. Peter. Dear Remus, are you all right? We haven't heard anything from you. I hope you haven't tried Muggle Post. I'm at the Potters now, and it's great. His parents are really nice, nothing like mine. James is being a bit of a pain. He thinks we're both getting on the Quidditch team this year and keeps getting me up at 6 to practice flying. Completely bonkers. It's sort of fun, though, and if Gryffindor needs a beater, then I might try for it. I can't wait to show you my broom. You can have a go on it if you want. You might like flying better if you have decent equipment. James reckons your matron won't let you come. Do you think if he wrote to Dumbledore or McGonagall, then you could get permission? You're a wizard, after all. You shouldn't get stuck with muggles all summer. If you really can't come, are you going to go to Diagon Alley for your school things? Maybe we can all meet there in August? Hope you're okay. Sirius O. Black. Dear Remus, it's not the Marauders without you. Please come. We've got loads of room and Mum doesn't mind. I've been training Sirius and Pete for Quidditch next year. I reckon that if we get you over your problem with heights, then we can make you a decent beater. You like hitting things, don't you? And you're probably the strongest of the four of us, so I reckon it makes sense. Sirius wants to be a beater too, so he can show you how to do it. I'll even see if we've got my old broom still lying around in the shed and you can have it. James. Dear Remus, please come and save us from James's reign of terror. I don't even want to be on the Quidditch team. Peter. Dear Remus, I hope you're getting these letters. We started to get worried about you. We all went to Diagon Alley together. It was great. James's mum bought us ice creams and let us go wherever we liked. Probably spent about 3 hours in quality Quidditch supplies. I really wanted to get out into Muggle London and find a record shop, but we weren't allowed to leave the alley. Andromeda sent me this new album. Merlin, you really ought to hear it, Lupin. It's better than Electric Warrior. It's better than anything. I'm sure the singer is actually a wizard. Have you ever heard of David Bowie? Are you having a good summer? What's it like being back? Write soon. Sirius O. Black. Dear Sirius, please don't send me any more letters. Can't read them, and Matron getting annoyed by the owls. See you on the train. Remus.